Hey guys, tonight we slide into a pool of lamplight where parchment breathes like cool skin, and you can hear every small noise that ink makes when it decides to be brave. The scriptorium waits benches worn smooth, air smelling faintly of lime and wool, your fingertips hovering over a sheet of vellum that still remembers wind and pasture. You tuck your shoulders, slow your breathing, and accept the simple truth that you probably won't survive this. At least not without getting drowsy enough to mistake your quill for a toothpick. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, drop your city and your local time in the comments. I love seeing the little constellation of night owls around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You ease your elbows onto the desk and everything steadies. Candlelight climbs the curves of your knuckles, turning you into a patient statue, a temporary saint of stationary tasks. Across the room, a monk coughs in Latin, which is to say, politely, and the cough echoes off stone and timber, returning as a soft amen. Your page lies there, calfskin turned into canvas, edges still cool with the memory of rinsed lime. A fine dust sparkles on the surface where someone earlier smoothed the grain with pumice, and when you slide a fingertip across, it whispers, not like paper, but like the faintest scrape of snow. You're not writing yet. You're just learning how to listen. The room itself knows what to do. Lanterns blink like well-trained stars, and the tall windows have gone dark, reflecting the silhouettes of bent heads, a small forest of concentration. You think about how these rooms repeat across medieval Europe, at Tours, at Street Gaul, at Wearmouth Jarrow, later in university towns where everything smells like rent and ideas. That's your first easy fact to cradle. Monasteries and cathedral schools run scriptoria, where biblical texts, commentaries, and eventually secular classics are copied in careful hands, line by slow line. No mystery there, just method. The day is measured by bells. The bells are measured by breath, and your breath drifts into the shape of letters even before ink touches the page. You glance right and left. To your right, a tray holding a quill that you will absolutely not chew, at least not on camera. To your left, a small knife to trim the nib, and if necessary, to scrape away minor regrets. In front of you sits a glistening drop of iron-gall ink that looks like a midnight with ambitions. We'll get to all of that in due time. For now, you let the vellum cool under your palms. It's a small luxury, this feeling cool as river stone. Your mind goes quiet enough to notice ridiculous things, like how your heartbeat syncs with the candle flicker. Light joke 1. Congratulations, you are now a human metronome with delusions of artistry. Behind you, a window rattles as the night tests the leaded glass. You imagine the sounds travelling in, the soft clop of a horse that would rather be in bed, the distant bark of a dog who solved nothing, the mutter of market tarps taking a nap. Your desk creaks when you shift your weight, and you apologize to it, like it's an elderly relative who heard your bones first. Jokes aside, this is where the practical magic happens, and you feel the room asking you to be unhurried. Real books, the kind that people will hold centuries from now, do not appreciate being rushed, and if they could talk, they would be a little smug about it. You lean closer and smell something faintly animal because yes, this page used to have opinions about grass. The transformation still amazes you, skin to sheet, hide to halo. Somewhere, outside this room, a parchment are hauled, soaked, stretched, scraped, dried, and polished, until the surface turned into a stage so quiet that even your smallest mark will count as a speech. The quirky tidbit floating in your mind tonight is that scribes sometimes smooth stray fibers with a bit of earwax on the fingertip. It's practical, mildly gross, and exactly the kind of detail that will lodge in your brain forever, like a very polite barnacle. You're welcome. You keep your hands open and wide, so you don't leave prints of oils on the leaf. You imagine lines that aren't drawn yet, a grid as faint as a whispered plan. Tomorrow you'll prick and rule and square the runway for sentences, but right now you just map the territory in your head. That tiny note of humility sneaks in. You're a traveller, not an owner. You're passing through this rectangle of time, and someone else will pass through after you, pointing at your letters centuries from now, arguing whether you were careful or careless. Historians still argue whether medieval readers mostly read aloud or silently in these rooms. Tonight, your eyes do the reading, and your breath does the shushing, and both seem correct. Down the bench, a scribe scratches a tiny hand with a pointing finger, a manicule to mark a place to revisit later. You clock the flourish with its cuff and cufflinks of ink, and it makes you smile. Margins, you realize, are where personality hides. Later, you'll meet snails wearing battle gear and rabbits practicing mixed martial arts. For now, the jokes hum softly under the surface. Light joke 2. Somewhere in the future, someone will annotate your work with lol and a heart, which is just the modern form of a manicured pointing hand. A bell from the cloister floats in like a mildly late cloud. Time for a stretch you pretend you don't need. Your shoulders go back. Your spine performs an unadvertised miracle. The room seems grateful. You notice the quiet hierarchy of tools. The penknife with its reflective blade, the pen rest with its little grooves, the pounce box like a tiny drum of powdered eggshell waiting to improve the vellum's grip. You lift the quill, feel its center of gravity, and set it down again because you are romantic but not reckless. Tonight is orientation. Tomorrow is ambition. You catalogue a few truths to anchor your sleepy brain. Fact to tuck under your pillow. Carolingian reforms in the 9th century encouraged a clear, rounded script Caroline minuscule that made text more legible across regions. The typographic truce brokered by policy and patience. Another anchor, the rule of street. Benedict organized monastic life into prayer, work, and study. Reading and copying texts slide into those hours like quiet neighbors. You accept the comfort that structure brings. If someone asks why you're so calm, you can blame a 6th century rulebook and the ergonomics of humility. Your attention drifts back to the page. You feel the slight give where the skin once warmed the animal's flank. This sheet has a spine, a grain, a direction, and your hands learn it the way a dancer learns a floor. You test a corner and see the sheen of fat that will need guiding, coaxing. A little pat of pounce, so the ink will sit like a guest who intends to behave. The candle pops. A tiny comet of ash lands harmlessly in the border, where someday a vine might unwind into little gold leaves. Light joke 3. You and the candle share a wattage rating labeled mood. The night balances on a thin wire now. You think about the invisible network spinning between rooms like this across lands you might never see. A codex copied here, travels to a library there, gets read by a student who becomes a teacher, who tells a story that changes a law that saves a life, that writes a letter that ends up pressed like a flower between pages, that all began with someone touching cool vellum and deciding to begin. You hold that thread and then let it slacken, because this is boring history for sleep, the kind where boredom isn't an insult. It's a quilt. Beyond the walls, wind moves through the joints of the world. You look down and realize your shoulders have fallen into their rightful place, that your jaw has remembered its job is not to audition for leadership. You let the quiet build a small nest inside your skull. In the margin of your blank page, you sketch with the tip of your fingernail the mildest of shapes. A curve that could be a letter that could be a leaf that could be a path. No ink yet, just intention, cool and steady. You set the quill on the rest one last time, and flatten your palms gently on the vellum, the way you'd flatten a wrinkled map that disagrees with your plans. Morning will bring lines and measurements, and the long migration of words will begin its patient crossing. For now, your job is simpler. Keep watch with the page, learn how it listens, and let its silence braid itself into yours. You yawn, not because you're bored, but because your body recognizes the rare luxury of being exactly where you need to be, doing exactly nothing more than preparing to do something well. The candle gutters, recovers, and then steadies again, as if to say, we can go on. You nod. You can. You step outside the scriptorium's hush and into the parchmenter's world, where the air is not romantic unless you find lime, wet hide, and determination a kind of perfume. You follow the calfskin from arrival to afterlife, a quiet transformation that begins at a trough. The hide sinks into a cool bath of slaked lime, and you stir it with a paddle, listening to the slow clop of liquid against wood. The lime loosens what needs to let go. Hair, epidermis, the clingy little bits that remember weather. You give the trough a gentle nudge with your hip and think, yes, this is the first lullaby, the bath that turns meadow into page. Mainstream fact to pocket while you breathe through your mouth. Medieval parchmenters typically used a lime soak, not tanning, because tanning would make the surface too oily to receive ink cleanly. Days pass, or rather your sleepy sense of time stretches like the hide itself. You pull the skin from the bath, and it hangs in your hands with the heft of unedited potential. Along the edges you punch holes to carry cords, Then lash it onto a wooden frame, the hearse, until it's taut as a drum that intends to be quiet forever. You run a fingertip along the rim of a hole and feel how the skin already wants to shrink, to tighten, to become smaller and brighter. You reach for the crescent knife, the lunellum, and you begin to scrape. The blade whispers. Long strokes push away softened hair, flakes of loosened flesh, tiny curls of before life. You keep your angle shallow, your pressure steady, because you remember how in the scriptorium you promised to be romantic but not reckless. The page remembers promises. The wind slips through the yard. You catch how the stretched skin changes pitch as you move across it with the blade thick areas, speak in low murmurs. Thin ones sing almost inaudibly. You smile at the thought that you are basically tuning an instrument you'll later play with ink. Light joke. 1. Congratulations. You are now the world's sleepiest luthier, crafting a very flat violin that only scholars pretend to dance to. You pause to flex your fingers. The lime has kissed your knuckles dry. The hide has left a clean, pale sheen beneath your blade. You draw the edge across again, collecting ribbons of what no longer belongs. When the scraping is done for this pass, you let the frame rest on pegs, and you notice sun and breeze becoming co-workers. The parchment tightens as it dries, crawling inward until it thrums at a tap. You test a corner, then dust the surface with pounce pulverized chalk or cuttlefish bone to take down any slickness that would make ink skate like a distracted ice dancer. You hear a distant bell from the monastery, and you count its beats without stopping your hand, a small metronome of intention. Earlier you learned a page could be cool as riverstone. Now you learn it can be taut as deliberate silence. You flip the frame, and the flesh side meets your gaze creamier, more porous. The hair side keeps a faint memory of grain. You decide how much personality this page should have, because every sheet is a negotiation between polish and honesty. You draw the lunellum again, gentle arcs that remind you of the manicule's cuff back in the scriptorium, a flourish that points you toward patience. You work around thin places, leave strong zones broad, and listen. A parchmenter once told you he could tell when a skin was ready, by the sound it made under a thumbnail if it clicked like a quiet bead. You were close. If it sighed, you had work to do. Historians still argue whether such craft lore varied meaningfully by region, or if we're projecting our modern hunger for neat maps onto a messier, more local reality. Either way, your thumbnail approves, or it doesn't, and tonight it nods. You carry the frame to a smoother bench and reach for pumice. The stone hums across the surface, raising a delicate dust that smells faintly mineral and a little like the workshop's patience. You sand until the nap is even, then brush, pounce, brush again. Quirky tidbit drifting in with the dust. If you make a small smudge later, a pinch of fresh bread can act like an eraser, just knead it to a sticky crumb and dab. Yes, lunch is also a tool. Try not to confuse your sandwich with your stationery. Light joke 2. If you eat your eraser, you're not hungry, you're editing. You glance at the rack where other frames hang like windows toward the future. Sheep, goat, calf, each gives a different feel. Sheep parchment often shows a soft cloudiness. Goat can be tough and wiry. Calf, the prized vellum, glows with a fine, tight grain. Here's your tidy fact with a tripping hazard. Many people use vellum to mean high-quality calfskin parchment, but the words played musical chairs in medieval sources. Historians still argue whether vellum consistently meant calfskin across languages and centuries, or simply signaled fineness regardless of species. You run your palm over the surface and pick the term that feels kindest tonight. Canvas. Because it's about to carry more than its weight in dreams. You rotate the frame again and scrape in shorter strokes, evening the thickness, watching for those little translucent windows called veins, where the skin thins near former vessels. You do not chase perfection past wisdom. A few flecks of former life remain at the edge. You leave them, they'll live under a margin or a binding, a tiny fossil of process. Light joke 3. If anyone complains in 500 years, they can take it up with your time machine's customer support, which is famously understaffed. Clouds pass. The breeze turns shy. You ease the cords, test the sheet's spring, and finally unhook the hide-turned parchment from the frame. It sags just slightly in your hands, then squares itself as though remembering its new manners. You lay it on a table and weight the corners with smooth stones, the kind you might once have skipped across a stream but now instruct to behave. A fine mist of water, a final pass of pumice, a breath of pounce, and the leaf turns from almost ready to ready, in a way that feels more like a change in listening than in look. This is the moment you try not to ruin with a sneeze. You trim the edges into a rectangle, or leave them deckled so the binder can decide. You mark the hair and flesh sides lightly tiny notches that will keep orientation honest when gatherings are sewn. If the sheet has a scar, you'll plan for it later with a simple patch or a decorative dodge. Errors and fixes are a choreography for another night. But you glimpse the steps. You set this leaf aside and begin another, because parchment doesn't make itself, and boredom as promised is the soft blanket you keep returning to. Work, not drama, makes durability. Some days, the yard is busy with seasonal demands. Colder months slow bacterial mischief in the lime. Warmer ones speed drying but invite flies that consider you an open buffet. You learn to work early, to shade frames with cloth when the sun grows nosy, to keep the lime fresh and not vindictive. The water from the stream churns a wheel that helps grind pumice, finer your medieval low-tech high-tech, as dependable as a fan's white noise. You smile, remembering the fan you told everyone to turn on, a modern cousin to this constant hum. The two sounds agree across centuries about what counts as soothing. By dusk, you stack sheets between boards with light weights, easing out stubborn waves, training the pages toward book-shaped behavior. You run your knuckles along the pile and feel the faint, hollow ring that means you kept tension true. Someone calls from the lane, a cart clatters past, and the world reminds you it contains dinner. You wipe the lunulum, rinse the trough paddle, and promise the frames you'll be back. In your pocket rides a crumb of pounce that will later dust the scriptorium's blank leaves like a quiet benediction. You pause in the doorway and look back. The frames sway slightly, still as held breath. You think of the scriptorium benches waiting, of the manicule's pointing finger, of the cool page under your palms the night before. Meadow to lime, lime to frame, frame to leaf. You've learned the ground beneath writing, the hidden labour that turns once mood into once moved me. You're ready to return inside, to lay the new sheet on the desk, and to let your hand begin the slow migration of sense across a surface that now understands how to listen. You return to the bench with your freshly made leaf, and discover that the next miracle is mostly about geometry wearing slippers. The page glows a little in the lamplight, hair side and flesh side, telling their subtle twin stories, and you set it down like a calm plank across a small sea. Before any letter can parade, you need lanes. Not grand avenues, just quiet tracks that remind words where to put their feet. You reach for the frame board, 2 uprights, 2 crossbars, holes drilled like patient stars, and loop thin cords across it so the leaf can rest without slipping. The page is not clamped, merely encouraged. In a life full of pushing, it's refreshing to guide instead. The pricking awl comes next. A needle with ambitions. You sight along the foredge, breathe once, and begin to prick the margin. Tiny, even holes marching down the side, then echoing on the opposite edge. They're so small you'd miss them if you blinked aggressively, but they'll carry the measure of every line to come. You keep the spacing steady, 2 fingers breadth for margins, a thumb and a sigh for the header, and you hear the faintest music, as metal meets parchment, a distant tick that keeps time with your pulse. Light joke 1. You've joined the world's least rebellious punk band, the Pricks, touring only quiet rooms, opening for silence. You lay a straight edge from hole to hole and draw a ruling stylus across the leaf. Not ink, heaven forbid you commit so soon, just a hard point that presses the faintest score into the surface, a line you can feel more than see. On some leaves you'll dust a faint wash of lead or charcoal to make the guidelines visible. On this one, the pressure alone will do. You pull the stylus gently from left to right, then right to left, and a ladder appears, calm and evenly spaced. Mainstream fact to tuck under your elbow. Many medieval manuscripts were ruled with a stylus or lead plummet after being pricked, a system so widespread that you can still spot the ghost grid centuries later when light rakes across the page. It's the scaffolding that stayed behind to haunt the house in a friendly way. You pause and run a fingertip over the ruled line. The texture is a whisper, a miniature valley ready to cradle ink. You lift the page to the candle, and there they are, those pricks along the edges, tiny constellations that turned chaos into choreography. This is how you keep the words from sleepwalking off the page. You give them lanes, you give them curbs, you give them a bedtime they can't argue with. You can almost hear the manicule you admired earlier clearing its throat to approve your traffic plan. For the verticals, margins, columns, the dignified cordon that keeps text from gossiping with the edge, you score firmer lines. Your straight edge knows the map now, and your hand falls into a rhythm. On a larger sheet, you'd mark 2 columns, but tonight your text wants one. wide and slow, a river rather than a pair of canals. You think of all the styles this framework will host. The open, round Caroline that breathes like a meadow. Later, the denser Gothic bookhand that stacks strokes like a careful stone wall. Historians still argue whether the tightening of scripts in later centuries owes more to fashion, to economics of space, or to the spiritual aesthetics of verticality, and you're content to assume it was a cocktail part taste, part budget, part devotion shaken by time's jittery bartender. You shift to the top margin and gently score the headline. The ruled horizon where rubricators will later brighten the first line in red, because even books appreciate an outfit change. Quirky tidbit, floating in like a moth. Some scribes puckered the parchment just so and rubbed the headline with a dry red ochre finger right against a guide thread, creating a blush of colour as even as a monk's poker face. No brush, just thread and patience medieval eyeliner for pages. You smile and resist the urge to try it immediately. Your ochre is asleep, and you'd rather it stayed that way. To keep the page from sliding, you lay a soft weight on the lower corner, your pounce box moonlighting as a paperweight, and check your pricks again. A perfect grid is not the goal, a dependable one is. You measure the gutter margin a touch wider to protect letters from disappearing into the binding later. You mark quire signatures, tiny letters or numbers at the foot of the leaf to help the binder sort gatherings in the right order. It's the bookish version of writing your name on your lunch, less possessive and more predictive. Light joke 2. If the binder can't reassemble your gatherings, you've invented confetti with aspirations. You take up the awl again for a set of deeper guide marks near the outer margin, little pits that will later anchor the vertical lines of gloss or commentary if your text grows ambitious and invites footnotes to the party. Some medieval pages blossom with those margins, main text in the centre, gloss snuggling the sides like enthusiastic friends. Historians still argue whether certain layouts originated in specific monastic centres or hopped trade routes like catchy tunes. The evidence is a patchwork quilt, warm but not entirely symmetrical. You mark your options anyway, like leaving hooks where future thoughts might hang their hats. The cord frame beneath the leaf earns its keep now. You loop a taut thread between matching prick holes at top and bottom, then draw your stylus along that thread, creating perfectly straight lines without risking the straight edge skittering across the slicker hairside. The thread twangs softly, an instrument you tune by eye. You're back to being a luthier for paper, the flat violinist whose concert begins with silence. You inhale pounce dust without meaning to, and decide the smell is fine. Very fine. Definitely not bread. Remember the crumb eraser from the yard? Same bakery, different course. Light joke 3. Every medieval workshop is just a kitchen that refuses to admit it. As the grid emerges, the page feels calmer, as if it knows who it is now. No longer a former calf, not yet a sermon or a saga, but a map with roads. You scratch in tiny catchwords, those sneak peek words at the bottom of a page that announce the first word of the next leaf, a clever safeguard against shuffled gatherings. Later, a binder will thank you very quietly. You also reserve space for initials, those drop caps that invite gold and blue to come dance. You pencil a soft square where a letter will later swell, leaving breath around it so that when you gild and paint, the text won't feel crowded, like a guest at a feast reaching for salt across too many elbows. You tilt the leaf and check the raking light again. The grooves look good, the horizontals polite, the verticals decisive. Mainstream fact to settle in your mind. The entire process, pricking, ruling, setting margins, was often done in batches before any scribe touched ink, a workflow efficient enough for monastic teams and later for urban workshops, where division of labour kept books moving like well-behaved caravans. You imagine a line of leaves, each with its faint music of lines, drying beside one another, like identical twins with slightly different laughs. The awl's point has grown warm from your fingers. You set it down and flex your hand, the small muscles along your thumb singing a humble psalm. You blow gently across the page to clear the last dust. If you listen, you swear you can hear the quiet grid answer, a cat's purr of readiness. You picture the manicule again, the pointing hand already deciding where it will wag its finger at future brilliance or nonsense. Margins are expectation disguised as emptiness. They wait for either decorum or mischief. Tonight, you promise both. Before you leave the bench, you make one last practical note. In the upper corner, you score a tiny diagonal line, your personal ruling signature, the equivalent of a polite, "I was here," measuring the boring stuff so the beautiful stuff could happen. No one will notice unless they know to look, and if they do, they'll nod at you across centuries, a discreet fist bump between grid makers. You stack the ruled leaf under a board to rest, because calm deserves a nap. Outside the window, the sky has tipped from ink to diluted ash, a colour scribes would have named if they'd had Pantone. You rub your hands together to wake them, then hush them again. Next comes the quill, the nib, the dark river that will follow these lines home. You glance at the fan in some future listener's room, that soft background hum you recommended, and decide it sounds a lot like thread twanging against parchment, a steady promise of straightness. The page is ready, the lanes are drawn. No words yet, but the silence is shaped, and that, you realize, is half of writing, maybe the better half. You close your eyes, see the grid in negative behind your lids, and feel your breath align with its rhythm. When you open them, the leaf is still there, still ruled, still waiting. You smile at a job that is both invisible and indispensable, the kind of work that never gets a parade but quietly makes parades possible. You pick up the feather the way you'd pick up a small promise, lightly, but like you intend to keep it. The quill is goose, broad at the calamus, the hollow shaft that feels cool against your fingers. You turn it so the curve matches your hand, the arc that will make downstrokes honest and upstrokes modest. If you're right-handed, you prefer a feather from the right wing, because the natural bend keeps the nib angled toward the page. If left-handed, left wing. Mainstream fact to tuck in your sleeve. Medieval scribes overwhelmingly used goose quills for everyday writing, reserving swan or turkey, later for larger, shoutier initials and tougher tasks. You smile at the idea of a shouty initial. Somewhere a rubricator just fluffed their feathers. Preparation is the quiet alchemy. You warm a pan of clean sand until it feels like noon in miniature, and you bed the calamus in its grains. The heat hardens the keratin just enough to make the nib springy instead of mushy. Some people swear by aging quills in a cool place for months, others by a quick sand bath. Historians still argue whether long seasoning was common practice or later romantic advice, projected backwards by well-meaning nostalgists. Tonight, your sand behaves, and you take the win. You lift the feather and test the shaft with your thumbnail. The click is crisp, like the parchmenter's quiet bead test you learned earlier. Penknife time. You cradle the quill and make the first cut, slanting across the tip to create a wedge. Then a second cut to open the slit, a delicate incision that becomes the nib's breath. You shave the shoulders until they look like they could carry a sentence without grumbling. The undercut comes last, a slight hollow on the underside to form a reservoir for ink, the tiniest cup you'll ever trust. You hold the nib to the light, checking symmetry. Not perfect. You remember the caution against chasing perfection past wisdom, but true enough that it will write without inventing opinions of its own. Light joke 1. If your quill starts offering unsolicited advice, it's not enchanted, it just needs to be resharpened. You take a moment to scrape the feather's barbs away from the grip end. Decoration is for margins, not handles. The spine rachis remains smooth, a natural ergonomic curve. Medieval hands knew before anyone coined the term ergonomics. You score a tiny bevel on the left tine, because your letters like a hint of tilt, and then you polish the edge on a bit of pumice, until it stops catching at your fingertip. The quill has gone from bird to instrument, and it feels rude to rush an introduction. Ink calls from a small earthenware pot with a cork that smells like last year's harvest. You open it, and the scent of oak and iron drifts out, earthy tang, a little like a forest decided to write its memoir. This is iron-gall ink, the medieval stalwart. You remember the ingredients, like a kitchen spell. Oak galls, where wasps coax trees into making tiny fortresses. Vitriol iron sulfate, often from greenish stones found near mines, water or wine to coax it all together, and gum arabic to give the ink body and manners. Mainstream fact to admire. Iron-gall ink dominated European manuscripts for centuries because it bound chemically with the parchment fibers, darkening as it oxidized, which is why faded brown letters were once crisp black. The line begins grey, deepens to night, then settles into a sepia afterlife, a whole biography in a stroke. You stir the pot with a twig, and listen for that viscous whisper that says the mix is right. Too thin, and it will bleed like gossip into the vellum. Too thick, and it will sit up on the surface like a guest who refuses to take off their hat. The gum arabic keeps things civil, making the ink flow, not sprint. Quirky tidbit, whispered like a rumour between benches. Some workshops added a dash of wine or vinegar to the brew, claiming it kept mould shy and the colour bold. A few recipes even mention a pinch of clove or a drop of honey. Call it the medieval barista moment. No latte art, but the fragrance is surprisingly friendly. You test on an offcut the kind of parchment scrap you've been hoarding like future confetti. The quill kisses, then draws a thin, obedient stroke. You turn your wrist and try a downstroke, a hairline, a curve that might become an A when it grows up. The ink looks grey at first, then slowly darkens as air and time do their work. You breathe out. This is the chemistry. You can hear the line deepening, settling, becoming itself. Historians still argue whether specific regional ink recipes can be reconstructed with certainty from surviving manuscripts, or whether local variation and secret source habits make neat maps impossible. You shrug and decide the only map that matters tonight is the one between pot and page. Because you're thorough, you set a second pot nearby. Lamp-black ink, carbon-based, made by collecting soot from an oil lamp and mixing it with gum. It sits on the surface longer, less corrosive than iron-gall, and friendlier to gold leaf. You'll use it for outlines around gilded initials later, where shine needs a steady fence. For the main text, though, iron-gall keeps your strokes slim, sharp, and quietly permanent. Light joke 2. Permanent in manuscript terms means longer than your last phone battery cycle by several civilizations. You remember the pounce box, your moonlighting paperweight, and dust the writing field lightly so the first lines won't skate. Then you dip, not plunging the quill like a nervous diver, just enough to wet the slit and fill the small reservoir. You touch the nib to the pot's edge to shed the droplet that thinks it's a chandelier. Then bring nib to ruled line. The first letter lands, not as drama, but as proof of gravity. Your quill wants an angle of about 45 degrees. Your hand settles into a gentle triangle of fingers, feather, page. You draw the stroke and hear it, the soft, sandy whisper of nib on vellum, a sound that could put even an impatient mind to bed. Between words, you rotate the quill a hair to keep the edges fresh. Between lines, you trim the nib with the penknife's kiss when it starts to spread. You wipe the blade on a cloth that will someday look like modern art and continue. The rhythm becomes bodily. Dip, touch off, write, breathe, write, micro-trim, pounce, write. You're not hurrying, but the line appears as steadily as a slow tide. You remember to cap the ink when the candle flares, because you enjoy not setting your manuscript career on fire. A quick sidebar floats in with the candle smoke. Iron-gall ink, being acidic, can nibble parchment over centuries if mixed too strong or laid too thick. Conservators now read those bites like weathering on stone. Still, most pages behave for a very long time, and your careful, thin strokes won't wake any future archivist's dragon. You're writing for readers who are not born yet, which is both humbling and the sleepiest kind of flex. You reach a line break and notice a tiny fibre raised from the last stroke. You remember the quirky fix from the yard, yes, the breadcrumb eraser, but here you opt for the tiniest touch of your fingertip, barely damp with breath, to smooth it. You avoid the earwax trick you heard whispered effective, slightly unappetizing because tonight you prefer your margins to smell like ink and not like biology. Light joke 3. Your page is a no-wax zone unless it's gold. You switch briefly to a broader quill to test an initial, carving the nib wider, squarer, so the letters' strokes stack like small pillars. The lamp-black pot obliges with a matte line that will frame gold tomorrow. You scratch a guideline inside the penciled square you left in section 3, a promise to your future self that the gilding won't wander. You set that quill aside and return to your text quill, your everyday companion who knows all your secrets and only tattles when you press too hard. The feather's shadow drifts across the ruled ladder you scored earlier, and for a moment you notice how everything learned so far fits like joints. The parchment's tautness, the prick's constellations, the line's soft valleys, the quill's spring, the ink's slow darkening. It's a small machine made entirely of quiet. Mainstream factor lay gently on the pile. By the 12th century, professional urban scriptoria and stationers in university towns standardized much of this kit: ruled leaves sold in quires, ink supplied by recipe, quills pre-cut for common hands, so a student at Paris or Bologna could assemble a book like a careful sandwich. You lift the quill, let the last letter's point finish breathing, and rest it in the groove of the pen rest. You cover the ink, shake a last whisper of pounce that falls like a kindly snow, and sit back. The lines gleam damply, then settle into themselves, the way a thought finds its final shape after sleep. You exhale through your nose and feel incredibly, gloriously boring in the way of work that will last. Somewhere, outside, The fan in a listener's room hums in sympathy with your heartbeat, and the candles lessen in staying put. You clean the quill with a damp cloth, pinch the nib once to align its tines, and lay it down like a tool that earned its nap. Tomorrow you'll sharpen again, as naturally as breathing. The nib is a consumable, not a monument, and that ephemerality is part of the charm. You blow gently across the page, check for shine, and find only quiet. The ink has gone from grey tonight to a warm, sleepy brown at the edges, and the ruled lanes from section 3 now host a river that knows where it's going. You lean into the letters now, the way a musician leans into scales, discovering how shape controls tempo and how your wrist carries its own metronome. Your first practice line slows to a stroll in Caroline, minuscule the 9th century darling, open, round, unhurried. You feel each bowl and arch welcome air into the page. Strokes rise and fall like shallow breaths, ascenders with soft shoulders, descenders that don't go spelunking, and word spacing wide enough for a thought to stretch. Mainstream fact to keep steady. Under Charlemagne's reforms, Caroline minuscule spread through monastic centres as a clear, standardized bookhand, making text legible across regions and easing copyists' lives. You ride that clarity like a smooth road after weeks of cobbles. Your quill angle settles around 45 degrees, and the rhythm becomes gentle. A, E, I, O, U, vowels as pebbles in a calm stream. The round A sits like a closed little ear, listening to the margin. The E holds its tongue politely. Capitals uncial-looking, dignified drop-in for emphasis like tall cousins at a family supper. Light joke 1. Every Caroline capital looks like it arrived early, brought fresh bread, and refuses to talk politics. You notice how your shoulders react, less tension, fewer renegade lines. Reading this hand is like walking through a well-swept cloister echoes. Yes, but no tripping hazards. You tilt the nib more steeply and let time jump forward. Your hand sharpens into Gothic textura, and suddenly letters are architecture upright, closely parked, all those straight strokes marching like careful soldiers with tidy boots. You stack minims, the little verticals of I, M, N, U, until they look like fence pickets in close formation. A word like minimum becomes a picket puzzle, and you add the dotted I, with a gratitude that borders on prayer. Historians still argue whether the density of Gothic scripts arose primarily from parchment economy, fitting more text per page, or from aesthetic devotion to verticality and light-shadow contrasts that felt spiritually correct. You suspect a practical piety where budgets and beauty shook hands. Either way, you feel the pace quicken. Reading becomes a narrower doorway. You step through slower, then discover that inside, the hall is tall and echoing. You draw a G in Gothic form 2 floors, the lower loop like a locked pantry, and enjoy how it clicks into place. The S takes its long variant mid-word, a tall reed that only bows at line ends. You remember your earlier promise not to chase perfection past wisdom, but you can't resist refining the spacing, so the lattice of strokes looks like woven shadow. Quirky tidbit floats in from the margin. Some late medieval scribes, eager and slightly sassy, added biting, where adjacent bows of letters like de or bow actually share a stroke, nibbling into each other to save space and look stylish typographic PDA. Your wrist asks for a breather, so you try Anglicana looser, faster, with more curves and cursive ligatures joining letters hand in hand. It's a secretary vibe, office hours in ink. The R grows adventurous after certain letters. The F and S trail long tails as if they've been practicing calligraphic yoga. This hand hums like a Market Street quicker notes, lots of joining and parting. Mainstream fact to settle into the cushion. By the 14th and 15th centuries, cursive book hands and documentary scripts diversified for different tasks, charters, accounts, personal letters, while formal textura or rotunda stayed dressed up for liturgy and deluxe books. You see the division of labour right there in your strokes, party shoes versus work boots. Speaking of rotunda, you relax the verticals and widen the rounds. Italianate warmth seeping into your line. Rotunda looks like Gothic, after a holiday, still black letter, still formal, but with a sunnier appetite for curves. Your O is rounder, your B has a fuller belly, and the effect feels friendlier without losing dignity. Light joke 2. If textura is the tight corset, rotunda is the well-fitted cardigan that still gets you into fancy libraries. You coast a few lines in this warmth, happy that not every medieval letter was auditioning for a spire. Curiosity taps your elbow. You try insular half-uncial, the Irish-British island specialty from earlier centuries, where G turns into a serpent that learned calligraphy and F and S flirt with long tops. There's a bounce to it, a braided energy that remembers interlace and marginal beasts. The R after O looks like it's hitching a ride, and the T wears a hat with confidence. Historians still argue whether particular insular quirks travelled mainly with missionary networks or through more mundane book trade pathways. Either way, your hand feels the Atlantic breeze and writes a line that smells like oak and salt. You return to Caroline to reset your breathing, then flip a few centuries toward humanist minuscule, the 15th century revival that gazed adoringly at Caroline and called it ancient Roman. Close enough for a love letter. You open your bowls, flatten your serifs, and give generous spaces between words. Humanist script moves like a quiet boulevard, and you can sense its destiny as the ancestor of our familiar Roman type. Mainstream fact to tuck in your sleeve. Early printers in Venice and elsewhere modelled their typefaces on contemporary humanist scripts for Roman text and on Gothic for blackletter, letting handwriting's habits shape the age of print. You pull a line and see how easily your 21st century eyes relax. This is home territory for modern readers, which feels like cheating and also like relief. Between alphabets, you play with pen angle. At 30 degrees, the contrast softens. At 50, the downstrokes darken like evening. You practice ductus, the order and direction of strokes, until your hand writes from memory more than intention. A good ductus is like choreography. If you start the A on a downstroke, you don't argue mid-letter about whether you should have started elsewhere. You keep faith with the path. Quirky tidbit peeks over your shoulder. Some teaching books model alphabets included little arrows to show ductus long before modern worksheets were a thing. Medieval UX, honestly pretty usable. You sprinkle abbreviations into a test paragraph. A tilde for a missing N or M. A 7-shaped mark for et. A P with crossbar for per or pro. Space is money, time is bread, and you are a thrifty baker of meaning. You add a line ending and, with a flourish, a character on its own pilgrimage through history. Light joke 3. Abbreviations are just medieval texting, minus the emojis, although the manicule with its fancy cuff is arguably the original pointing finger emoji. Formal wear edition. Reading back, you can feel what the shapes do to your inner voice. Caroline makes you speak slowly, as if each sentence has a porch and rocking chair. Gothic textura tightens your cadence, stacking syllables like narrow stairs. Anglicana makes you chatty, humanist makes you editorial. You realize letters are gears, swap one gear, and the mind's speed changes. Historians still argue whether script choice influenced theological tone or simply mirrored institutional taste. Tonight, you accept that hand and thought are at least good neighbours who share fences and herbs. You test legibility in raking light, tilting the page so strokes flash and soften. In textura, the pattern looks like a woven shadow. In humanist, like spaced river stones. You circle a crumbly M and adjust pen pressure in the middle minim so it doesn't look like a fence with a missing picket. You add a few bitings where two bows can share a wall without collapsing. You correct a drifting baseline with a discreet scrape and a breath of pounce, remembering the bread eraser as backup if needed. The page purrs again, grid and letterform reaching détente. A small experiment tempts you. Rubric in red across the top line. You lift the lampblack quill for a dark outline around the capital you boxed in. Section 3, leave the gilding for later, and test a tiny Lombardic initial half blue, half red, divided down the middle like two polite roommates. The bowl swells, the stem sits proud, and you taste how display letters are costumes in a play whose chorus is the text hand. Mainstream fact, to hum as you clean your brush. Alternating red and blue initials became a common visual rhythm in many 13th century books, an economical way to decorate while keeping the page orderly. You stand the initial at attention and let it dry, already hearing future candlelight catch its edges. Before you pack tools, you write the same sentence in 4 hands across a scrap. Caroline calm, textura tight, Anglicana lively, humanist lucid. You blink and feel your brain shift gears 4 times in a few inches. This is the quiet experiment that every page conducts. Which rhythm do you want the reader's breathing to adopt? Your answer changes with purpose. Psalter, charter, sermon, study book, love note to a patron's purse. You cap the ink, strop the nib once on pumice, and rest your hand on the desk. The letters behave because you taught them manners, and because the page provided lanes. They're not soldiers or dancers exactly. They're house guests who know when to speak and when to let the candle talk. You glance at the margin, where a future manicule will point at a line you haven't written yet, and you promise it's something worth the finger wag. You move from letters to colour the way dusk moves to night quietly, with a pocket full of minerals. The bench changes personality. Out go penknives and plummets, in come mortar, pestle, a cloud of powders fine as rumours, and a tidy parade of shells, actual shells, because nothing holds a thimble of pigment like a muscle's patient curve. You set them in a row, and each one becomes a small lake waiting for weather. Light joke 1. Congratulations, you now own the world's cutest paint set. It fits in a pocket and stains everything forever. You start with blue, because your mind has been drifting there since the first ruled line. A lump of lapis lazuli sits in your palm, a dull royal stone from far away, the kind that looks expensive even when it pretends not to be. You tap it with the pestle, and it answers with a chalky thud, then a crunch, then a yielding into grit. Mainstream fact to keep steady while you grind. The most prized ultramarine in medieval Europe came from lapis, mined in Badakhshan, in present-day Afghanistan, arriving through long trade routes and costing so much that some contracts literally budgeted the blue separately. Line item for the sky. You listen to the powder become a whisper. Water joins, then a drop of gum Arabic sap from acacia, your soft-spoken binder that persuades particles to behave like a team. You roll the paste under the muller on a slab until it smears like a sky that took etiquette classes. You lift a little on your brush and test it in a shell. At first it's a modest blue, almost shy. If you wanted the deluxe ultramarine, you'd knead the crushed lapis with wax, resin, and lie in a sleepy, stubborn dance that coaxes purer blue from greyer gang. You decide tonight that your blue can be honest rather than aristocratic. Not every sky needs a crown. Historians still argue whether the strictest ultramarine for the Virgin's robe convention was widespread discipline or a later idealized memory projected backward. What's certain is cost-shaped choices, and sponsors love to see their donations glow like heaven. Next to blue, you set red, which comes in at least 2 moods. Vermilion mercuric sulfide is the extrovert, bright, dense, confident. You grind the cinnabar lump gently, because mercury's temper is famous, and bind it with gum. The paste spreads rich as a velvet curtain. Red lead, minium, is brighter still, an orange red that rubricators use to shout politely at the top of a page. You stir a small lake of it for initial strokes and headers, and set the shell aside where it can't audition onto your sleeves. Light joke 2. Pro tip, if your sleeve matches the rubric, you've invented wearable marginalia. Yellow crosses the bench with a basket of warnings. Orpiment, arsenic sulfide, shines like bottled sunshine and behaves like bottled sunshine with opinions. You use a dedicated tool, grind in a corner far from the food, and remind yourself not to mix it with lead white unless you enjoy watching chemistry file a complaint. For a safer, though paler, yellow, you coax colour from saffron or weld, plant-based dyestuffs that steep like tea and behave like polite house guests on parchment. Green arrives unruly. Verdigris. The copper salt that grows from hanging copper over vinegar makes a sea glass smear that can bite parchment over centuries if laid too thick. Malachite's mineral green is steadier, though less neon. Historians still argue whether the notorious halos and cracking in medieval greens came more from recipe variants or climate and storage. Either way, you promise to lay greens thin, like gossip you don't want quoted. Black, like a reliable friend, is simple. Lampblack soot collected from an oil lamp, and gum Arabic, ground until it flows like quiet ink with thicker shoes. Bone black, if you need it, brings a deeper night from charred bone. White, the shy workhorse, is lead-white flakes coaxed from lead and vinegar in a dance of corrosion, and it builds highlights like breath on glass. On parchment it sits kindly, but you remember Leeds' character and keep your lunch far from the bench. Quirky tidbit to tuck behind your ear. Some shops kept their pigments in tiny leather pouches or tied paper twists, but when paint was wet, shells ruled. The term shell gold, for powdered gold bound with gum and used like paint, gets its name from those impromptu pallets lined up like a tide pool of treasure. You pull a small vial of glare egg white beaten to stiff peaks, left overnight so the foam collapses into a clear serum, then strained into a sticky clarity. Mixed with pigments that need a silkier binder, glare tightens the paint's film and adds a fragile gloss. For dense body, you might lean on egg yolk, tempera. but gum and glare suit parchment's personality. Flexible, not crumbly, ready to hug down into the surface, instead of building a tower that future centuries have to rescue. You test a recipe. Vermilion with gum reads satiny. With glare it sharpens, the edges crisp as a whispered rule. The muller circles. Your hand finds the rhythm. You grind azurite cheaper, greener-blue cousin to lapis, until it gives a strong turquoise-leaning sky. You make a lake pigment by boiling madder roots in an alum bath, then precipitating the colour onto chalk. The rosy sediment dries to a warm red that layers like benevolence. Brazilwood brews another red, this one more transparent, singing through underlayers. Woad, stubborn plant dye, can tint a wash, though it prefers cloth. You note in your margin brain that some blues layer beautifully. Azurite under, ultramarine glazed on top like depth arriving late to the party. You set up order on a test strip. Blue, red, yellow, green, black, white, then secondaries orange from minium and saffron, green from indigo, and weld if you're feeling botanical, purple from ultramarine glazed with crimson lake. On parchment, colours dry darker than they look when wet, the binder clearing like fog. You tilt the strip to the candle, and the surface answers matte, ready for burnishing only where it meets future gold. Remember that gold has its own chapter of rules. Your pigments will be its neighbours, not its bosses. A trade map hums under your bench. You feel it even while you grind. Lapis from the east, vermilion from mines or alchemical hearths, gum from North Africa and the Levant, saffron from fields that stain fingertips yellow for days. Mainstream fact to lay calmly on your palette. The late medieval colour trade threaded through Italian ports like Venice and Genoa into transalpine routes that stocked Paris, Bruges and London. Stationers' shops near universities sold pigment packets to students who learned to turn syllabi into colour charts. Historians still argue whether monopolies tightly controlled streams of the rarest pigments, or whether a messier chorus of petty traders knitted Europe's blues and reds together. In your shells, supply has become a simple fact. There is blue tonight, there is red, there is enough to paint a margin beast and a robe. You paint a square of ultramarine inside the boxed initial you sketched in section 3, feeling the brush drag lightly across the vellum tooth. The blue dries speckled. You grind again, patiently, and float a second pass to even the field. Between layers, you breathe on the surface your gentle humidity trick to help particles settle. Light joke 3. You are now a weather system for an area the size of a postage stamp. Please use your powers only for calm. In the next shell, you mix verdigris thin, then test it in a vine border so its bite, if any, can chew on open space rather than text. You frame leaves with lampblack lines, feeling how carbon ink corrals the green, and you glaze a breath of saffron at the tips to warm them. The border begins to wake vine curling, leaf nodding, a tiny bird's beak considering a berry. You add a dot of minium at the berry's heart, because even berries appreciate attention. The page drinks the colour and leaves a soft sheen like remembered rain. Your brush rinses in a jar that soon looks like a rumour of rainbows. You dry it on a cloth that has clearly lived many lives and has no regrets. You turn to a marginal creature, a little hare considering a trumpet, and lay azurite in its cloak, vermilion in the instrument, white on the whiskers. The hare looks pleased, which is generous for a rabbit with musical ambitions. You smile and mark a tiny manicule near the joke's setup line, the pointing hand ready to snicker centuries later. For stability, you mix each pigment in small amounts. Fresh is safer than heroic vats. You label shells with a dot code, 1 for azurite, 2 for ultramarine, 3 for do not lick under any circumstances. You stack a few shells when space grows tight, balancing them like a precarious bento of sunsets. The fan you recommended to listeners becomes a timekeeper again. Grind in 8 breaths, paint in 12, rest for 4. Sleepy math, perfect for bedtime history. You glance at the ledger you keep for this project. 2 leaves blue, 3 borders green, 1 initial red-blue split, 1 rabbit with career aspirations. The column for expenses has a small note, lapis, patron supplied, and you picture the donor expecting to see that blue, and not say, a thrifty azurite. Patrons know just enough to ask for specific saints and specific colours. You know enough to make both look inevitable. You tidy the bench, cap the jars, and set the shells on a board out of reach of sleeves, elbows, and enthusiastic cats, imaginary or otherwise. Before you leave the colours to dry, you press the back of your hand lightly against a test patch. The paint is cool, not wet its way of saying, almost. In the silence, you hear the softest grain in the parchment, reminding you where you began. Meadow, lime, frame, grid, quill, and now lakes of colour catching small moons of candlelight. You cover the board with a clean sheet to keep ash from auditioning for stardom on your blue. The room smells faintly of gum and minerals, a fragrance that could be sold as library cliffside. Another speck of the matter. You blow out one candle and keep one, the better to watch blue deepen and red settle. Somewhere a bell counts an hour. You do not. Your colours breathe, and you breathe with them, knowing that tomorrow the gold will arrive like sunrise, and every hue will need to learn how to stand beside it without sulking. For now, the shells are still, the page soaks its dreams, and your hands remember the muller's circle even as your eyelids practice their own. You clear a corner of the bench like you're preparing a small chapel, because gold is not so much a colour as a guest with opinions. Out go the big jars of verdigris and minium. In come quiet tools. A leather cushion the size of a placemat, a broad-bladed gilder's knife that thinks it's a breeze, a soft brush called a tip that can pick up leaf without looking like it tries, a burnisher of polished agate shaped like a dog's tooth, and a jar of bowl red, silky, and slightly mysterious. The page already wears its penciled boxes from section 3, and the blue you laid in section 6. Now it wants sunlight. You begin by making ground for the gold to stand on. The bowl Armenian clay sifted into velvet mixes with a binder so thin it feels like rumour. You choose glare, that clear serum you skimmed from beaten egg white, because it dries hard and takes a polish like a vow. Some workshops add a touch of hide glue or fish glue, some stir in honey for flow. Historians still argue whether specific monasteries and urban shops favoured distinct recipes, or whether individual masters simply taught their quirks like family secrets. Whatever the lineage, tonight your bowl spreads like a blush that knows why it's here. You lay it within the outlined initial, a low swell, not a mountain raised, gilding wants contour, not altitude. As the bowl dries, you breathe on it. Literally. Your breath reawakens just enough moisture to make gold leaf adhere. It's not a magic trick, just humidity doing what humidity does. But it feels like you're whispering the sun awake. Light joke 1. Congratulations. You are now a human humidifier with a side gig as a sunrise coach. You test the tack by kissing the bowl lightly with the knuckle. If it grabs for half a heartbeat and lets go, you're in the gold zone. Too wet, and the leaf will wrinkle like a cranky bedsheet. Too dry, and it will fly away like it heard a better invitation. The leaf itself waits on the cushion, absurdly thin, beaten from a button of 23-24 karat gold into squares so fragile you can draft breezes with your eyebrows. Mainstream fact to pocket beneath your burnisher. Medieval gold beaters hammered leaf to astonishing thinness measured today in micrometers between skins or paper, producing books of leaf that travelled with painters and stationers. High carat gold resists tarnish, which is why these halos still glow even when everything else has gone to sepia. You slide the knife under a square and nudge it into place. Each movement slower than thought, gentler than patience. Static is both ally and mischief. Your breath helps the tip brush lift the leaf like a moth wing and float it over the bowl. You lay the leaf down, and time stops for a blink. It kisses the bole, and if you've judged the tack, clings without drama. You coax wrinkles flat with a soft brush, tapping rather than dragging, because gold, however noble, will tear if you speak sharply. You add a second piece to overlap the first, better overlap than gap. There's a reason borders exist. Light joke 2. Gold leaf is like a VIP at a crowded party. Give it personal space and it behaves. Elbow it, and it remembers another engagement. Where the leaf extends past the bowl, you leave it for now a feathered edge called skewings. Later you'll whisk the excess away with a squirrel hair mop and save those flecks for shell gold. Quirky tidbit to slip under your sleeve. Shell gold powdered leaf mixed with gum and stored in a seashell. Doubles as a repair kit and a paint for hair-fine gold lines. Some workshops literally scraped old backgrounds to recycle the shine into shells. Medieval upcycling. Glitter edition. You wait a few breaths, then breathe again, because raised gilding loves this small weather. When the bowl and leaf agree they're married, you lift the agate burnisher. Its surface, hard and smooth as frozen honey, presses the gold into brilliance. You rub lightly in small arcs, then longer strokes, and the matte dawn turns into noon. The sound is faint, a silky squeak that only gold and stone know. The curve of your burnisher matters. The dogtooth shape gets into corners without bruising edges. If you owned a boar's tooth, you could use that too. Earlier workshops did, though agate is the patient modern of the Middle Ages. Between strokes, you tip the page and watch candlelight skate. The gold's mirror becomes your teacher. A dull patch says more pressure. A bright patch says enough. You ride the line between enthusiasm and heat. Friction warms bowl, and warm bowl softens, and soft bowl shifts. And then a saint's halo slumps like a halo that didn't read its call time. You slow down, breathe, burnish. The circle becomes crisp, a little sun you can touch. In another corner, you test mordant gilding gold over paint that's sticky when dry. You mix a tiny pool of oil-based size with an understated smell that suggests linseed gossiping with time. Mordant gilding doesn't burnish to the same mirrored blaze as water-gilded bowl, but it grips complex shapes and fine lines with fewer nerves. Historians still argue whether water gilding on bowl dominated in deluxe liturgical manuscripts, while mordant took over in more secular or later urban products, or whether the choice was more about shop habit, climate, and deadline than genre. Your experience tonight says, both are friends. Pick the one your weather and conscience prefer. You return to the raised halo and add punchwork, a constellation of dots and petals hammered into the gold with tiny steel punches. This isn't violence, it's music written in shine. Little suns scatter around the central blaze, and the texture makes the halo sparkle even in low light. A few common punches, dots, rosettes, starbursts live in a small cloth roll, each with its personality. You tap them in rhythmic rings, the way you once ruled lines in Section 3. Measure with feeling. Mainstream fact to set beside your agate. English and French workshops in the 14th century developed lavish, diapered and punched backgrounds in gilded miniatures, patterns so fine you can feel them with your fingertips centuries later. The page becomes an evening sky pretending to be noon. Where gold meets paint, you outline with carbon ink, so edges read like intention, not accidents. A blue robe from Section 6 now sits under a gold nimbus that actually looks like light. You add a hairline of shell gold along the robe's fold for a whisper of gleam. Metallic highlights like these are desserts, small, sweet, used sparingly. You correct a tiny bald spot in the leaf with a dot of shell gold, tapping it until it fuses like a discreet secret. You try graffito, scratching a pattern through a thin glaze of pigment over gold so the bright metal shows as line. A vine curls on the initial stem, leaves cut out of night. You smile at the way techniques borrow each other's hats. Paint pretends to be line pretends to be light pretends to be solid. The page pretends nothing. It simply agrees to hold everyone's disguises. Because prudence is an unsung saint, you note the hazards. Lead white and orpiment dislike each other. Verdigris likes to snack on parchment if too rich, and iron-gall ink can sulk under thick gold if trapped. You keep layers thin and dry thoroughly between steps. Light joke 3. Think of your page as a medieval apartment, thin walls, many roommates. Label your food and don't start a vinegar and copper cooking show at 2A. You step back and inventory the bench. On the cushion, a book of leaf half gone, the rest safe between papers. On the page, an initial that catches candlelight like it's hoarding dawns, a halo so smooth the agate wants to preen. In the shell, a few milliliters of liquid sunrise, your shell gold, ready for repairs and filigree. In your chest, that steadying breath again, the one that turned bowl tacky and made the leaf listen. A last mainstream anchor, before you let your eyes soften. By the 13th century, raised, burnished gilding was a signature of high-end manuscripts, the luxe in deluxe, while flat, mordant gilding and gold paint broadened access to shimmer in less princely books. Even when print arrived, illuminators kept working, hand-adding initials and gold to early printed pages like old friends showing up at a new party with the best snacks. The continuum comforts you. Technique outlasts fashions when it solves a simple problem: how to make light stay. You whisk away skewings with the soft mop, flex snow into a jar with the softest chime. You tip the page to raking light and watch the gold fire, then quiet. In the corner, a rabbit from Section 6 considers its trumpeting career under a new gilt border and appears to approve rabbits are famously susceptible to luxury. You set the sheet in a safe place and cover it with clean paper. No drafts, no cats, no elbows, only slow air and the fan's cuisine hum from some future bedroom where someone is falling asleep to the thought of you breathing on clay to make the sun stick. You tidy the knife, fold the book of leaf closed, polish the burnisher on a scrap of chamois until it winks. The room smells faintly of egg and metal and quiet, you know, because your hands know that tomorrow you'll punch another halo, lay another field, fix another bald spot with shell gold, and all of it will still feel like catching tiny dawns on the edge of sleep. You blow out one candle and leave one, because gold deserves an audience, and you deserve to watch it glow a little longer before the grid and the quill call you back to their slower music. You turn the page sideways, the way a gardener turns a trellis to catch more sun, and the margins ask for company. Not words those own the middle, but borders that breathe, vines that wander without getting lost, interlace that ties neat knots in space, and well-mannered creatures who promise not to steal the show. You set out small brushes, the lampblack for fine outlines, the blue and green you tuned in section 6, a dot of shell gold for glints learned in section 7, and the ruled ladder from section 3 becomes a frame where decoration can stretch its legs without stepping on the text's toes. You start with a simple bar border, a vertical band along the outer margin, crisp as a spine. A thin black line first, steady as a pulse. Then a band of ultramarine, another of vermilion, separated by hairlines so colour reads like stripes on a sleeping flag. At intervals, you plant square stations, tiny boxes that will sprout leaves and creatures. Mainstream fact to keep your hands steady. By the 13th century, bar borders with foliate sprouts were common in Gothic manuscripts, often expanding at the top and bottom into corner pieces, so the page felt tied with a ribbon. You run the line to the top and feel the relief of an edge made visible. Borders are just kindness, disguised as geometry. The sprouts begin with pen flourishes, curves outward from the bar, shapes that double back and tuck under, stems that carry leaves shaped like ivy, oak, or trefoil. The trick is rhythm, not repetition. You let one sprig reach, the next curl inward, the next hold a berry like a thought. The brush lifts and alights like a moth. The line varies with pressure, and suddenly your parchment grows a polite garden. Light joke 1. Congratulations, you're landscaping in centimetres, which is like regular gardening, only fewer beetles and more opportunities to judge your own breathing. Where stems cross, you test a miniature knot. Interlace isn't hard, it's honest. Over, under, the same lullaby sung by basket makers and lace-smiths. You draw 2 ribbons that weave and leave small almond-shaped voids. Vesicae that the eye reads as order, the mind as calm. You add a 3rd ribbon, and your brain claps quietly. Historians still argue whether particular interlace motifs travelled from insular workshops into continental habits through migration of books and people, or whether parallel tastes flowered from shared geometric games. Either way, your knot makes time look braided, and the margin sighs like a cat. You choose leaf types with intent. The ivy leaf, with its sharp little lobes, energizes a line. The acanthus, curled and juicy, softens it. You mix a malachite green for the base, then deepen the shadows with a whisper of indigo. Lift the highlights with lead white that sits like dew. A tiny shell gold dot at the tip of a tendril makes it look mischievously alive. The border feels awake but not caffeinated. You pause, tilt the page to catch light, and the gold winks like it knows the punchwork 2 sections ago taught it manners. Creatures arrive as you lay leaves, not the pranksters of next section that's their party, but well-behaved residents of this hedgerow. A bird perched on a sprig, head cocked at the rubric, a lizard sunning itself on a red bar, a hare, yes, again the trumpeter from section 6 has cousins, who tucks its paws under like a loaf of bread and stares at the manicule you'll add later, as if to say, I see you. Quirky tidbit to tuck behind a leaf. Some workshops gave their border beasts tiny halters or collars, a visual pun on tameness, as if to reassure patrons that whimsy came house-trained. You give the lizard a thread-thin collar in shell gold because you enjoy being in on a joke 500 years late. At the top, you set a spray, a burst of stems that arc into the header and then relax into the gutter like a yawn. In French shops of the later 14th century, these ivy leaf sprays could fill half a page with airy lace. You keep yours modest tonight, noting the style with a nod rather than a fanfare. Along the bottom, you thread a thin baseline extender, a curlicue that runs under the last line of text and keeps the eye from falling off the edge. The extender ends in a leaf so it doesn't poke the reader's attention like a stick. Your lampblack pen returns to draw filigree inside leaves, vein lines that fork neatly, a chevron pattern that makes a leaf seem embroidered. You add a tiny pearled line alternating dots and dashes along the bar border, a rhythm common in Paris and London, where stationers like their decoration to look like jewellery that learned to read. Light joke 2. Medieval page design tip. If you can't decide whether to decorate, imagine the page going to a polite dinner party. Does it need earrings? That's your answer. A tangent flourish wants to misbehave, so you tame it with a knot. Over-under solves many sins. You mark small bridges where a stem should appear to pass behind another, and paint a shadow so the illusion holds. The painterly truth re-emerges. Even on parchment, light and overlap teach the eye to relax. You borrow a technique from section 7 and punch 2 dots in the gold bead at a corner. Texture catches light, and the border smiles without widening its mouth. Because the page is a conversation between center and frame, you pace your decoration. Where the text will later host an important line, you let the vine lean in. Where the text needs silence, you lean the vine back. Mainstream fact to slide into the foliage. The mise-en-page, page layout, of many Gothic manuscripts, coordinated initials, rubrication, and border growth to spotlight textual divisions, psalm incipits, chapter openings, so decoration doubled as navigation long before bookmarks were invented. Your border becomes not just pretty but helpful, like a librarian who's excellent at small talk. You allow one hybrid, a tidy half-creature peeping from a leaf-human face with a leafy beard, a green man in miniature. He doesn't blow scrolls or spit vines, yet no spoilers for next section. He just exists as a reminder that plant and person have swapped hats in art for ages. Historians still argue whether such leafy visages in margins carry pagan survivals, Christian allegories of renewal, or simply decorative delight. Your little face avoids debate by keeping his eyebrows impeccable. The manicule, who will eventually wag a finger at a theological tidbit down the page, seems to approve from your imagination's balcony. A corner asks for a diamond diaper pattern. A grid of tiny lozenges filled alternately with blue and red, each punctuated by a white dot. You draw the diagonals lightly with a lead plummet, then paint the checkerboard, letting the white of the dot be untouched parchment. The effect is cloth-like, a whisper of tapestry beneath the leaves. Your hand settles into the nap of the pattern. Boredom here is bliss, the fan's hum turned into geometry. Light joke 3. If anyone asks your weekend plans, you can now say, painting 100 tiny diamonds, and mean it, which sounds like a punishment and feels like a spa. The technicals insist on their say. You keep greens thin so verdigris doesn't stage a long-term coup. You separate orpiment from lead white by a polite buffer. You outline leaf edges in carbon, so the iron-gall text won't look smudged if a future humidity wave pays a visit. You dust a breath of pounce where paint will meet quill tomorrow, ensuring outlines don't feather. Old friends return. The crumb of bread erases a graphite hesitation. The penknife lifts a stray droplet that auditioned in the wrong spot and did not get the part. You step back and sight along the gutter. The border shapes echo the rhythm of your text lines without trapping them. The page feels like a room with wainscoting decor down low, quiet above. In a corner, 2 birds face each other across a berry, and you resist making them argue. Their job tonight is to hold a dot of red like a promise. You whisper a thank you to the bar border for being the kind of architecture that keeps a party cozy. A last pass. You add hairline tendrils that loop into nothing, just to let the eye wander and return. You tuck a tiny ladder motif into one space, 4 rungs. A nod to the ruled ladder from section 3 because callbacks make the mind purr. You dab shell gold on the tendril tips, almost nothing, so that when candlelight rakes, the page answers in Morse code for still awake. The manicule outline lands in pencil near tomorrow's doctrinal sparkle. It waits. Cuff not yet coloured, finger already opinionated. You cover the page with clean paper and breathe. The border is done for tonight, not crowded, not sparse, a tidy conspiracy of leaves and manners. You feel the continuity. Parchment from section 2, grid from section 3, quill from section 4, letters from section 5, pigments from section 6, gold from section 7, now here, braided into a frame that pretends to be merely pretty, while actually doing quiet editorial work. The rabbit in the lower corner, no trumpet this time, union rules, keeps watch. The fan in someone's room, miles and centuries away, hums in sync with the loop of your last tendril. You turn the page gently and let the border dry in darkness that behaves. You tilt the manuscript so the border you tended in section 8 becomes a little stage, and right on cue the actors wander in uninvited, unbothered, deeply committed to mischief. A knight in full mail lowers his lance toward a snail. The snail, undeterred, raises its feelers like they're licensed for jousting. You hold your breath to avoid laughing at church because the main text is a psalm, but the margin clearly thinks the psalm can share the pew. Light joke 1. You have discovered the medieval meme, hand illuminated and thoroughly sticky. Drolleries, that's the tidy name scholars use when they want to sound responsible about jokes. They bloom along lower margins, bas de page, and creep up borders like ivy that learned comedy. Mainstream fact to keep in your sleeve. By the 13th and 14th centuries, especially in English and French books like the Luttrell Psalter and the Gorleston Psalter, margins commonly housed hybrids, animal antics, and domestic slapstick visual riffs that coexist with sacred text without, apparently, causing lightning. You glance at your gilded initial from section 7. It looks only mildly scandalized. The snail keeps his night busy while the next sprig supports a cat playing the bagpipes, cheeks puffed, tail politely wrapped, expression heroic. On the opposite side, a monkey cleric reads a book upside down. Between them, a small man rides a hobby horse toward a large duck who is extremely unimpressed. Historians still argue whether these scenes carry pointed allegory, satire of cowardice, or clerical folly, or whether they're playful exercises in inversion, simple delight, a shop's house style of wink. You decide your page can hold more than one reason at a time. Human brains have had that feature for a while. You bring the lampblack back to outline the snail's shell, a tight spiral with a whisper of lead white for highlight. Your hand knows how to make it glossy without letting verdigris nibble the parchment later. You add a teeny banner in the knight's hand, no words yet, just a flutter that invites future rubrication if you're in the mood, and the scene becomes a mural the size of a thumbprint. Quirky tidbit to slide under the lance. Some margin snails appear to grow from the foliate border itself, shells sprouting where leaves meet stems, as if the plant life and the punchlines share roots. You turn to the lower margin and sketch a wrestling match between two rabbits, long ears crossed like antennae receiving a joke from the next choir. In the distance, well, the lower outer corner you tuck a hunter running away from a rabbit with a spear. Role reversal is the favourite sport down here. It keeps hierarchies flexible like good leather. Light joke 2. If the rabbits unionize, your trumpeter from section 6 will negotiate a generous carrot clause. The page's centre stays composed, text hand marching politely, rubrics blushing at the right places, but the edges offer relief, the way a room with wainscoting lets your eyes rest low. Mainstream anchor to lay gently on the margin. Parisian artists like Jean Poussel introduced airy, grey-washed scenes, threaded with drolleries in luxury books of hours. Think Jean d'Evreux, early 1300s, while English workshops leaned harder into riotous bas de page cycles, where entire miniature comics play out beneath psalms. You picture a patron reading devotionally, then peeking down to see a fox hearing confession from a rooster. Impeccable pastoral care if you don't mind the lunch risk. What are these jokes doing here? You try on a few hats. Did they help memory? Like mnemonic hooks that make a line of text stick by associating it with a weird picture? Maybe. Did they keep the scribe awake? The reader attentive? Almost certainly. Did they let shops show off their range? Yes, we do serious theology, and also rabbits who moonlight as sheriffs. Absolutely. Historians still argue whether a specific drollery should be decoded like a sermon, or enjoyed like a doodle. The decoding urge is strong, but the laughter arrives before the footnotes. You draw a centaur with a scholar's hood, penning something in a tiny book. He looks ashamed of his horse butt, which is tender of him. You shape a fish with legs strolling out of a blue bar into a field of red. Because why not? Your border is a passport office where physics applies mostly on weekdays. Near a parchment scar, one of those thin, translucent windows you spared back in section 2, you paint a tiny bridge and let a mouse march across the floor. Quirky conservation flourish. Scribes often stitched tears with thread. Sometimes illuminators incorporated those neat little mends into decoration, turning repairs into features. You dot shell gold on 2 stitch holes and they read like intentional jewellery. The scribes themselves whisper from the margins too, not with pictures but with words. A classic complaint crawls in. Oh, my hand, or this parchment is hairy, or my favourite. The weather is foul, and my pen is terrible. You imagine the manicule from earlier pointing right at such notes with sympathy. Mainstream fact, easy and dear. Colophons at the ends of text sometimes include scribe names, dates, even jokes and prayers. In margins, smaller asides survive little human exhalations, preserved by the book's polite reluctance to forget anything. Your bagpipe cat gets stripes, Cats in margins are often competent and smug, which feels historically consistent. Beside it you add a tendril that loops into an initial Q, the tail of the letter becoming a leash for a tiny dragon who is visibly considering whether to cooperate. To avoid turning the page into a zoo, you paste the jokes one per palm width, then a quiet patch of foliate dignity. Light joke 3. Remember, the margin is like dessert. Too much, and you nap through the homily. Snails return, because they always do. You draft 3 tiny variations into the lower right. A snail offering a flower to a knight hiding behind his shield from a snail, and a snail perched triumphantly on the shield boss. Historians still argue whether the snail motif encodes social commentary about slow but inexorable forces, taxes, death, mocks timid nobles, connotes resurrection coiled shell, emerging creature, or simply delighted artists with its absurdity. Your page votes for all of the above, plus snails are funny. Anaphelian resses. You keep PG-13 by letting the earthy joke stay suggestive rather than explicit. A figure bends to smell a flower with suspicious determination. A monkey moonlights as a cautious vintner. You hint at kitchen humour without staging the after-dinner show. The border remains a respectable party with a few good storytellers who know when to lower their voice. Craft still rules. You thin your paint so outlines for faces don't fuzz. You switch to carbon for black hairs so iron-gall doesn't spread. You tap punchwork gently into a gilt bead near a punchline so light sparkles like laughter. You use the crumb of bread to lift a graphite line where a rabbit's foot wandered, then pounce to calm the parchment, then outline again with steady lampblack. The bread eraser from section 2 keeps earning its lunch. A small cycle begins to thread across the lower margin. In the first scene, a fox preaches to geese. In the second, he leads them. In the third, he carries one under his arm while looking pious. You keep the goose expressions neutral, too much despair, and you'll wake the archivists. Mainstream fact to lay beside the fox. Reynard the foxtails circulated widely in the later Middle Ages. Fox and goose scenes in margins nod to that tradition of trickster satire, where sharpness survives by wearing a cassock of wit. In a corner you draw a little scribe, painting a little scribe, painting a little scribe, mise en abîme for the win. He sits on a leaf you painted an hour ago, which is physically impossible and conceptually perfect. He's holding a penknife dangerously near his own marginal foot, but you trust him. He's you and not you, and he seems tired in a way that makes you fond. You give him a dot of shell gold on his knife, because every artisan deserves a gleam. Does the sacred mind the silliness? You glance at the text. Earnest, beautiful, intent. The margin's play doesn't tear the fabric, it hems it. The jokes live where the eye can visit them between lines, where a little laughter oils the hinges of attention. Historians still argue whether certain patrons encouraged more levity, or whether workshops simply had in-house humour levels baked into their brand. Account books rarely itemize snail budget. Your ledger, however, now boasts 2 snails, 1 bagpipe cat, 1 fox homily, 1 centaur scholar, 1 rabbit HR incident. You breathe and listen to the fan you told everyone to turn on, that soft purr that keeps edges from feeling too sharp. It matches the whisper of lampblack on vellum. You touch the page where the jokes dry. They're cool now, as if they belong. The border you planted earlier cradles them. The gold you burnished 2 sections ago makes their eyes twinkle when the candle leans over to watch. The ruled lines from section 3 hold the text steady, while the margin rehearses rebellion in miniature, and then politely sits back down. You cover the page. The cat keeps playing. The snail keeps advancing at a rate easily measured in centuries. The fox keeps preaching to anyone who'll listen. You smile, close your own eyes for a long blink, and let the basse de page lull you toward that place where ideas get weird and kind, where one more doodle might solve nothing and still save the evening. You wake before the page does, because bells have opinions about dawn. The first one lifts through stone like warm bread smell, and you roll from pallet to sandals, mind already humming the day's tune. Prayer, work, study, repeat, with small commas for soup and silence. In the cloister, cold air licks your cheeks awake. In choir, voices fold into each other until your spine remembers it's part of a column of sound. When you return to the scriptorium, the quiet isn't empty. It's the afterglow of psalms arranging your breathing into lines, the way your ruling stylus arranged the page back in section 3. Structure is the invisible bench your elbows rest on. Mainstream fact to lay gently on the desk. The rule of street. Benedict, 6th century, set a scaffolding of hours. vigils, lauds, prime, later replaced, terce, sext, nun, vespers, compline within which monastic life braided prayer, opus dei, manual labour and reading. Across the Middle Ages, houses adapted the exact timetable, but the bell remained the metronome for the hand and the eye. You feel it in your wrist, terce for beginning, sext for pausing, nun for finishing a choir's side before stew. You don't race the bell, you let it tow you. Before the first dip of the quill, you stop by the armarium, the cupboards where choirs sleep upright like tidy geese. The custers, the librarian brother notes, which gathering you borrow with a stub of wax and a memory that could shame an elephant. He grunts approval at your progress and hands you a length of cloth to wrap the choir when you carry it, so your warmed fingers won't print oil lilies on the flesh side. Light joke 1. The medieval equivalent of use a coaster is use a choir, cozy. And honestly, your coffee table wishes it had thought of that. At your desk you find your tools lined like a small procession. Quills trimmed last night, pounce ready, lamp-black cap on tight, iron-gall winked closed like a disciplined eye. You settle, and the bench greets your hips with that familiar creak that implies long friendship and minor gossip. On winter mornings, a brazier sulks in the corner and pretends to heat the room. On summer ones, the window grills spill a square of light that tries to climb your page. In some scriptoria, especially later, in big houses you'd have carrels, little wooden stalls with slanted desks like monkish cubicles, windbreaks for thought. Here, benches run along the wall, faces to the light, backs to the hum of brothers paging and whispering nothing. Silence is not the absence of noise. It's a grammar. You can ask for what you need with a sign. Monastic sign language keeps the refectory quiet and wanders into the scriptorium too. Quirky tidbit to tuck into your sleeve. There's a sign for butter, rubbing fists, a sign for book, palms opening, and in some houses a sign for ink, fingers stained or pinched as if holding a nib, which, if you're honest, you overuse like a person who thinks more coffee might solve ontology. You catch a brother's eye and sign pounce, and he rolls you the small drum with a benevolent look that says, "May your consonants cling, I not mean to vase pride." The bell for prime used to divide the dawn. Reforms later tidy it differently, but your body still divides the long stretch into sips. Write a line, breathe, listen. Lectio Divina, the slow reading that is part prayer, part study, seeps into how you copy. Even if the text is a homily instead of a psalm, you mouth the words as they appear, letting sound teach spelling. Historians still argue whether medieval reading was primarily vocalized or silent by period and context. In scriptoria like this, the hush is full of small lips moving and minds pacing the sentence aloud in very quiet shoes. Your breath rides the clause, your hand follows. Mid-morning, the custers brings a bundle of hair cords to replace the ones on the ruling frame. He offers a crumb of advice about spacing. He's the type to measure his soup by psalm, then vanishes with the glide of someone who has perfected the art of not knocking inkpots with sleeves. You pull your choir closer, and the day folds into how much, how well, how clean. The metrics are simple. A certain number of lines before sext, a certain number of pages this week, a choir ready for rubrication by the next bell. You don't track word count, but if you did, it would be a prayer rope of syllables, steady and kind. In the refectory at sext, you cue your spoon and swallow soup, while another brother reads from a stand, voice clear enough to cut bread. You keep your eyes on your bowl. This is listening time. If you must ask for more, you sign it. Words are on strike at meals. The reader stumbles on a proper name and pauses. A few heads lift and then lower as he corrects. Light joke 2. The only place where grammar gets more attention than soup is a monastery, which is why medieval indigestion is primarily inflected in the ablative absolute. After the meal, the cloister walk steadies your legs. You trace the covered walk around the garth, look at the herb beds where fennel and rue pretend to be saints, and let your eyes rest on not letters for a minute. The billiard table calm in your head welcomes the green. Back inside, the custos has left a small slate at your place, with a word, collatio. A handful of you will meet in the evening to compare your copies against the exemplar 2 readers, one reading aloud from the master text, the other checking the new pages while your eyes follow. Mainstream fact to hold with your napkin. Correction routines varied. Some houses read and correct daily, others collated by the choir, and university stations formalized loan and correction systems so multiple hands could copy one exemplar, making peace rentals a business in Paris and Bologna. Your slate means tonight you'll lend your eyes to the communal net that catches dropped letters before they become tomorrow's doctrine. Back at the bench, the light has shifted. Shadows from the grills make a faint ladder that climbs across your lines, a callback to your ruled ladder that still pleases you more than it should. You adjust your angle so the glare doesn't turn your lamp-black outlines into mirrors. The candle's wick mushrooms. You pinch and trim it with the snuffer so it stops smoking like a monk with opinions. Light joke 3. Congratulations, you've added Candle Wrangler to your skill set. LinkedIn endorses you in tallow management. Work shares space with small mercies. On especially cold days, a fur-lined sleeve might appear for winter use, courtesy of the sacrist. On hot ones, your superior reminds everyone that a nap after dinner does not constitute heresy if the bell wakes you. Cat the cat. Yes, someone named the cat. Cat. Austerity meets irony patrols for mice and occasionally leaves paw prints in the margin. A paw seal that future scholars will cite with gleeful footnotes. You pretend to be annoyed and leave a tiny doodle of a manicule petting the print later, because everything on this page is a conversation, and Cat knows you're easily charmed. Your eyes tire just before none. You pause and stare out past the stone mullions to the sky that does not care about corrections. A brother drops his penknife. 5 heads lift in synchronized empathy. You touch the penknife in your own palm and remember how many rescues it has staged today. A lifted blob, a scraped serif, a trimmed nib. The bell rings, the room exhales. You stand, flex the ache out of your fingers, and realize that the ache has become a friend who never borrows money. Evening brings collatio in a small side room where the air smells like vellum, warmed by breath. 2 readers sit elbow to elbow. One chants the exemplar, syllables spaced like beads. The other follows your choir with a finger that taps when ears and eyes disagree. You wait your turn, correcting lightly with pale ink, marking a caret where a word needs insertion, dotting an omission in the margin with a manicule that looks almost apologetic. Historians still argue whether the high accuracy of many manuscripts owes more to communal correction rituals like this, or to individual scribe excellence and exemplar quality. You feel. Tonight, how many nets hold up a good text? Compline folds over the house like a soft cloak. In cell, you whisper the final psalms and imagine the gold halos from section 7 still catching whatever moonlight negotiates the shutters. You catalogue your day, not in drama, but in measures. 1.5 pages in textura that did not look like a picket fence after all. 3 rubricated initials behaving, 1 border tendril from section 8 that circled without getting dizzy, 2 drolleries from section 9 that stayed PG-13, a cat who refuses to credit your supervision. What you don't count but feel anyway. The drift from bell to bell that kept your mind from sprinting. The way prayer slowed your vowels so your consonants could be precise. The way soup and reading braided into a rope you can hold when your eyes blur. The rhythm looks rigid from the outside. Inside, it feels like a hammock. Historians still argue whether monastic discipline suppressed individuality in the name of order or liberated attention by outsourcing decisions to the bell. Your bones cast their vote for liberation, mostly because deciding everything all day is exhausting, and your best letters arrive when choices are few, and kindness is many. You blow out a candle that has learned to behave, notch your place with a strip of leather, and lay the quire under a board so the page doesn't curl overnight. The bench, relieved of your weight, goes quiet. Somewhere, a brother snores in Latin. You smile in the dark at the memory of your breadcrumb eraser from section 2, your manicule with its cuff from section 1, the snail who tied a night's day into knots, the rabbit who still wants a trumpet solo. All of them will be there in the morning, right where the bell set them, waiting for the next line to find its lane. You come to the desk expecting harmony and get a sneeze. Not yours, the page's. 1 letter blooms into a blob, a minuscule accident with maximal drama. You watch the ink swell like a tiny storm cloud, and then you do what the page trained you to do. Breathe first, then rescue. The penknife, your humble hero from a dozen quiet crises, slides from its sheath. You tilt the leaf so raking light shows the mistake's edges. Then you set the blade almost flat and begin a rasura, a gentle scrape that lifts the top whisper of skin where the ink sits. The sound is a faint hush, like someone smoothing a sheet. You stop before the fibers complain, dust on a little pounce so the surface tightens, and the scar becomes a memory that agrees to keep your secret. Light joke 1. Congratulations, you are now a dermatologist for vowels. The choreography of correction feels older than your habits, because it is. Mainstream fact to tuck under your knife. Medieval scribes routinely scraped and rewrote, Whole leaves were even recycled as palimpsests. Original text erased or washed, and a new text written over it famous today, in cases like the Archimedes palimpsest, where later prayers hid earlier math. You're not erasing history tonight, only a puddled E, but the kinship stands. The page forgives slowly and then precisely. You test the spot with the pad of your finger. If the skin feels feathery, you stop. If it feels smooth, you consider a tiny damp breath and a burnish with a polished bone folder to coax the surface closed. A good correction reads like calm. You write the letter again, lighter, and the line, bless it, pretends you never stumbled. You set the knife down, point the manicule toward your own margin, note mind your speed, and move on. Sooner or later, a bigger mistake arrives. A skipped word that refuses to hide under grammar's rug. You make the caret sign, that little hat of atonement, and carry the missing word into the margin, writing above or beside the line with a modest flourish, so the eye can find it later. If it's more than a word, say, a phrase you add, a marginal sign, a matching pair of marks that look like squiggle twins, so the insertion knows where to go when your future self, or a corrector with a red pencil, walks the page. Historians still argue whether certain correction symbols were standardized across regions, or mostly shop dialects. Paris speaking in tidy twins, England doodling bespoke arrows, but either way the page becomes bilingual in text and fix. Sometimes parchment itself rebels. A thin place you humoured in section 2 tears under an enthusiastic T. You do not panic externally. You reach for your sewing kit, fine linen thread, and a needle as shy as a rumour. You pull the edges together and make 2 or 3 tiny overcast stitches, then rub the back with a breath of glare to quiet fuzz. The result is a respectable scar, something a later reader can love. Quirky tidbit to tuck under the spool. Some medieval repairs form neat butterfly-shaped patches, little parchment appliques pasted over holes and then painted around mend as motif. Error promoted to feature. If your tear falls in a margin, you might even loop it into a vine from section 8, or let a rabbit from section 9 admire it like a window. When ink smudges into a letter next door, you try the bread trick again. Fresh crumb dab to lift soot or graphite and, on good days, to lighten a recent iron-gall blot before it bites too deep. Bread has been your sidekick since the yard. You promise to buy it dinner. For stubborn shine, the slick patch that makes ink skate you dust, pounce or rub lightly with pumice. The page accepts these little scoldings, then behaves. Light joke 2. You are essentially parenting a square of former cow, and yes, it is a good cow. It just needed a nap and a snack. Glosses arrive the way birds do, first one, then a flock. A tight column of commentary sidles into the outer margin. An interlinear note perches between lines, and suddenly your polite page hosts a town hall. You draw vertical guidelines to pen the gloss in, then open a modest gate where the gloss must slip back into the text with a reference sign, sometimes a little ladder, sometimes a letter pair. Mainstream anchor to set near your elbow. Scholastic books in the 12th and 13th centuries often married main text to gloss as a norm, think the glossa ordinaria on the Bible, with layouts designed for dialogue. Scribes planned for this by ruling spaces and using anchor signs so nothing wandered off like a bored goat. Your margins, already trained by borders, accept the extra residence. Not every fix is a scrape or a stitch. Some are diplomatic. You discover that your exemplar has spiritus, where your theological instinct whispers spiritus, lowercase versus uppercase, with doctrinal spice. Do you normalize? You mark the letter with a pale red dot and leave a note to check at Calatio, remember, section 10, before promoting a noun to glory. Historians still argue whether capitalization conventions were authorial, scribal, or late correctors' choices. The archive reads like a family argument passed down with the furniture. Tonight you choose caution over crusade and colour the rubricator a question mark made of politeness. Across the choir, you meet a prior scribe's bandage. A small parchment patch glued over a cut, feathered at the edges so it lies flat. The ink on the patch looks a hair different, more brown, less night, because iron-gall ages like oak. You write across the seam anyway, then lift the page to the candle to admire how both eras tolerate each other. Light joke 3. Your book has more plastic surgery than your town gossip, and all of it is tasteful. Your punctuation, too, learns to mend confusion rather than cause it. Punctus elevatus, a dot with a small tick above. To cue a mid-sentence lift of the voice, punctus interrogativus, a dot with a bending tail. where a question curls. Simple punctus for a rest. You deploy them like road signs so that a reader nodding off at sext won't drive a clause into a wall. If you inherit a stretch of text with scant punctuation, you add discrete points in pale ink, a later hand helping an earlier one. Historians still argue whether heavy punctuation reflects late medieval oral reading habits, shifting towards silent study, or simply the fashion of schools. Your dots feel like kindness either way. Now and then, an entire line goes off-key. Too low, too crowded, too enthusiastic with abbreviations. You scrape the whole stretch, feeling both barbaric and benevolent, and write it again with wider air. If a rubricator's red wandered into your black, you pull a hair-fine brush with lampblack and crisp the edge. If your own black trespassed onto gold, section 7 says hi, you whisper shell gold over the trespasser until light forgives. If a green from section 6 sulks into a crackle along a leaf, you feather in a glaze of yellow lake to warm it, then outline anew so the floor becomes patina, not problem. You learn a small spell for oily fingerprints. A dab of diluted casein, the milk protein binder wiped very sparingly, can degrease a smug smudge and give ink purchase again. Do not drink your casein. It is a beverage only in the most medieval sense. You note the spot in the margin with a tiny milk drop symbol of your own invention. The custers will either be impressed or pretend not to notice your personal hieroglyphics. Quirky, yes. Useful, more. At the choir's end, you write a catchword and then a small plea. Orate pro scriptor. Pray for the scribe, because even corrections need intercession. Sometimes, when you've had a week heavy on rasura and light on triumph, you add a sigh that survives centuries. Heu, or O bon Jesu de finis, O good Jesus, give an end. Mainstream fact to keep. Such colophons, half prayer, half wink, dot manuscripts across regions and periods, anchoring the text's impersonality to a person with tired knuckles. Your manicule points, of course it does, at your own complaint. A tiny cuffed finger chuckling in solidarity. The scholarly itch never leaves you alone. Was this error yours or the exemplar's? You compare hands in the margin, the colour of correction ink, the ductus of the added word. Historians still argue whether layered corrections map generations of readers or a single day of collatio with many pens. Pigment analysis and patience are writing a detective story one dot at a time. You are content to be a chapter in that story and to leave the rest to someone with a microscope and a fondness for ghost alphabets. When the bell finally leans on the evening, you cover the page and look at your desk. A neat drift of eraser crumbs, a dignified penknife with a shine on its spine, a pounce box with new respect, a thread snipped flush where a tear found its stitch. The page sleeps flatter than it woke, its scars enlisted into the design, its glosses perched like thoughtful birds, its letters aligned like citizens who grumbled, adjusted, and then marched. You are absurdly proud of this boring heroism. Errors happened, fixes followed, sighs exhaled, and then got back to work. You blow across the surface one last time, the same breath that made gold stick and lines straight. The fan in some future bedroom keeps humming, you suspect, partly to honour these minutes when small tools repaired small things, so the larger thing the reading could move like a river with fewer stones. You stack the quire, set the board, notch a leather marker, and put the knife to bed. The silence accepts your apologies and your solutions with the same gentle shrug, and the page, contrite and composed, glows like something that overcame just enough to be interesting. You gather the leaves the way a beekeeper gathers, calm, slow, certain, listening for the hum of pages finding each other. Each ruled, written, corrected leaf from earlier nights becomes part of a quire, 4 folded bifolia nested to make 8 leaves, or 5 to make 10 depending on appetite and text. You check the hair-flesh sequence so openings face like proper couples hair to hair, flesh to flesh because light glints differently on each, and you prefer marriages without petty glare. You prick the fold for sewing stations, the same even logic you used in section 3, and stack the gatherings until the book-to-be has the polite heft of a loaf you'd share with friends. Mainstream fact to lay on the bench. Most medieval codices were sewn through the fold on raised supports, cords, or leather thongs, then laced into wooden boards, forming a structure so stubbornly sound that many spines still breathe in libraries after 6, 7, 8 centuries. The sewing frame stands like a modest doorway. 2 uprights, a crossbar, cords stretched taut like the strings of a nap-prone harp. You loop your sewing supports hemp cords for strength, sometimes tanned leather or alum-tawed thong for joy, and knot them so they hang just proud of the forthcoming spine. You settle the first quire against the frame, thread waxed linen through a curved needle, and begin at the kettle station, the end hole where kettle stitches will tie gatherings together. The needle dives, surfaces, dives again, catching around each support in a rhythm that feels suspiciously like prayer said with your forearms. Light joke 1. Congratulations, you now bench press books, which is the genteel cousin of arm day. The thread sings, a faint creak against holes you pricked true. At every support you wrap, link, tighten, not violin string tight, just enough to make the spine a rope ladder. You add the next quire and kiss it to the first with a kettle stitch. That small sailor's knot at the chain line that prevents drama. The chain builds, gathering by gathering, until the spine shows tidy rows of thread like soft armor. Historians still argue whether regional sewing patterns, herringbone verses, all along, packed verses, spaced map to specific shops or to individual binders' habits hiding inside large traditions. Either way, your hands obey the book, not a map. Between quires, you set guards where a heavy initial from section 7 might stress the fold. Thin strips of parchment that distribute tug and keep the text block from sighing itself apart. Quirky tidbit, waste parchment, and even scraps of older manuscripts often live invisibly here. Spine linings, guards, patches, so fragments of forgotten texts survive as the book's underwear. Conservators find them with the glee of archaeologists and the restraint of librarians. You smile at the thrift, and the company yesterday's doctrine bracing today's psalm. When sewing's done, you lift the block off the frame and feel its new vertebrae. The raised bands sit proud across the spine, soft hills that will become ridges you can count with your thumb. You tap the spine lightly with a beating hammer to settle the swell, coaxing the thread and fold shoulders into a single agreeable curve. Not too much you like your books unbruised, but just enough that leaves stop acting like individuals at a parade and start behaving like a parade. Light joke 2. Your resume now reads, Book Whisperer, Amateur Chiropractor. Boards next. Oak if you want stubborn dignity, beech if you prefer lighter obedience. You mark, drill, and chisel small channels on the board's inside face, aligning them with the sewing supports. Then the magic move lacing in. You draw the cords through their channels, out to the outer face, then back in through a second set, peening them into small swollen wedges that lock board to text block without asking glue to carry the marriage alone. Mainstream anchor. True laced case, medieval bindings rely on the mechanical strength of supports and wood, which is why these books shrug when centuries lean on them. Glue is an assistant, not the boss. You trim the spine just enough to square shoulders, then paste on a simple spine lining, usually parchment or textile, to unify the back and protect the folds. If the text block is a touch enthusiastic, you add a second lining cross-grain to calm it. Parchment remembers its animal life by trying to curl. Boards and clasps will later tell it no. This is why books wear hardware, because parchment is spring steel in a nice outfit. You understand. End bands are next. Those little embroidered rainbows at head and tail. You anchor a core cord or rolled leather between the boards, then couch-coloured thread over it in chevrons, catching the first and last leaf with regular stitches so the whole edge resists splaying. Functional first, pretty second. Later centuries will sometimes fake sew end bands for looks. Tonight, yours do actual work. You pick colours that nod to the rubric red and ultramarine blue you mixed in section 6, because continuity makes even spines purr. Historians still argue whether certain end band patterns denote regions or merely fashion cycles. Your chevrons vote fashion with muscle. Covering day smells like animals and tannins. You choose alum-tawed pigskin if you want pale, tough and willing. Vegetable tanned calf if you want warmth and a future patina that will make readers go soft in the knees. You pare the turn-ins thin with a French knife until the leather edge feels like a whisper. Paste wheat starch cooked and cooled until it acts like diplomacy spreads over spine and board. You draw the leather across, feathering over the raised bands so they stay proud, tucking around the head caps with thumbs that learned from burnishing gold in section 7, how to be firm without being cruel. The leather darkens as it drinks, then relaxes like a shirt after ironing. Light joke 3. If your book had shoulders, it would ask for a massage and tip in bookmarks. You cut small V notches at the board's corners to avoid bulky ears, then pull crisp miters that will make you proud in raking light. At the foredge, you plan for clasps, because parchment is a diva about humidity. You set strap plates on the lower board, anchor them with clenched brass nails that look like gold's sensible cousin, and fit catch plates on the upper board. When you close the book and the clasps click, the The text block settles as if someone tucked it in. Mainstream fact to cradle. Clasps, straps, and sometimes four-edged chains kept parchment codices flat. Chain libraries like Hereford and Zutphen literally chained books to desks to prevent walkabouts while allowing in-place consultation. Historians still argue whether chaining primarily deterred theft or standardized reading within shared spaces. Your book, equipped with furniture, simply appreciates not being mistaken for a kite. While the cover dries under gentle weight, you add bosses, little metal mushrooms to the board faces so future readers don't grind the leather on tabletops. Corner pieces follow, the bookish equivalent of toe caps. If your patron is a practical peacock, you tool the leather with a hot roll or a simple palette-lined fillets around the board edges and stamp a small rosette in each corner. You resist the temptation to gild the title. That trick waits for later centuries. Your ornament remains medieval, handsome, useful, quiet. Inside, you paste down end leaves you planned back in section 3. Thicker guards that bridge text and board, sometimes marbled in later ages, tonight simple and clean. You nip the book in a lying press and let it dream while paste remembers it's supposed to be dry. Quirky tidbit. Some binders sprinkled their paste with clove or thyme to discourage insects. Others trusted cats and scowls. Your paste smells faintly of wheat porridge and good intentions. When you unclamp, the spine holds its line, the boards sit true, the clasps say their tiny click, and the text block purrs. You stand the book on its tail and admire the raised bands like ridges on a sleeping animal's back. You open it and feel how the sewing lets it lie without sulking, how the end bands quietly resist overreach, how the boards partner the parchment spring. It's a machine made of fibre and patience, as plain and clever as a door hinge. You test the joints. The leather flexes without whitening, the turn-ins lie snug, the head caps show tidy ears, the lacing pegs refuse to budge because you drove them well. The book smells of oak, flour and pigskin, with a ghost after-scent of iron-gall and glare from earlier days. You run a finger over a raised band and think of the cords on your ruling frame. The hair cords the custers brought in. Section 10. The thread you waxed, and the kettle stitches you tied like quiet promises. Everything is cords, really lines you set and honoured. You write a small ex libris on the front flyleaf for the patron, copy a prayer for safekeeping, and add a manicule in the bottom margin, pointing toward the first rubric with a cuff that now matches the end band. The rabbit from section 9 would approve if he hadn't union rules about appearing outside margins. You clasp the book again and feel it become a single object, a text, a shelter, a tool, mainstream anchor to fold into your satisfaction. Early print shops kept binders busy into the hand-press era, finishing sheets into codices. Binding is not an afterthought, but a second authorship that decides how reading will feel in the hands. You set the volume on the shelf upright between friends. Bosses forward, clasps sleeping. Historians still argue whether specific binding schools can be isolated cleanly or whether workshops borrowed freely from neighbours and itinerant journeymen. Oak here, beech there, tord here, calf there, creating a landscape of family resemblances rather than heraldic houses. You stroke the spine as if to say, whichever the lineage, you were made to last. Floods will come, fashions will sneer. This book has boards, bands and brass that believe in outliving both. When you finally step back, the fan in someone's room many centuries later hums the same low key as your clasps clicking home. The gold from section 7 still catches a memory of candlelight inside. The border from section 8 makes the foredge look like it has thoughts. The corrections from section 11 sleep under paste and promise. You have built something slower than hurry and stronger than opinion. A quiet machine for moving meaning through time. You set your palms on the boards, feel the oaks cool, and let the silence confirm what the structure already knows. This will hold. You step out of the cloister's echo and into a street that smells like dough and damp rope, and suddenly the book you've been building meets its other life commerce. Bells still keep time here, but so do shutters, carts, and a stationer's door that creaks like a rumour. Inside, the benches look familiar, slanted desks, shells for pigment, a cushion for gold, but the rhythm is city fast. Contracts breathing in piles, exemplars sleeping in chained stacks like dragons who only hoard paragraphs. Mainstream fact to set on the counter with your coins. By the 13th century, university towns Paris, Bologna, Oxford organised bookmaking through licensed stationers and the Petcha system, renting out exemplar pieces so multiple scribes could copy at once, speeding production for students who needed Aristotle yesterday and law tomorrow. You feel the tempo in your fingers. This is still a scriptorium, but the bell rings in francs. The stationer, ink under his nails and numbers behind his eyes, slides a ledger toward you. Rates shimmer like heat. So much for acquire in textura, more for fancy rotunda, extra for rubrication. Gilding priced like weather, uncertain but expensive. Light joke 1. You realize you are now in the premium toppings portion of the menu. Yes, to ultramarine is the truffle oil of the Latin world. He notes your preference for raised gilding. Section 7 left you spoiled. Your fondness for ivy spray borders. Section 8 said it was okay. Your tolerance for bagpipe cats. Section 9 suggested moderation. You initial the margin with a discreet manicule and agree to a deadline that feels like a dare. Exemplars sit under chain and key. Aristotle, Gratian, Peter Lombard. The odd medical text that smells faintly of mint and ink. The stationer reads the title aloud, then unhooks one pettia 20 or so leaves and hands it to a copyist, with a chalk mark that matches the ledger's shorthand. Historians still argue whether Patia copies maintained higher textual fidelity than monastic copying, or simply different errors, duplications, omissions, harmonized spelling produced by speed and the musical chairs of hands. Either way, a chorus of quills sings the same page across 3 benches, and a week later a book exists that didn't before. You love the efficiency and forgive the occasional typographic jazz. Patrons materialize like weather systems. A canon with a careful purse commissions a modest breviary, good text, few pictures, no drolleries that might attend the wrong meeting. A duchess, cheeks warmed by velvet and influence, orders a book of hours, with a calendar bright as her dining room. She wants her family saints in the litany, her castles in the miniatures, and the Virgin's robe in ultramarine, not azurite. She knows the difference because someone told her to. Quirky tidbit to slip between orders. Some contracts literally stipulate how many blue initials per quire, or how much gold per page, itemizing holiness like a grocery list. The bills read like recipes for glory. You nod and ask whether she prefers diapered backgrounds or landscapes. She says both, as if you offered bread and butter, and gestures to a bolt of velvet that could buy your entire pigment shelf twice. Outside, porters grunt past with crates that clink like small fortunes, rolls of vellum, packets of gum arabic, a book of leaf that rustles like moths rehearsing. Inside, apprentices stir glue that smells like polite fish, scrape quills in piles, and carry shells of colour like waiters who will not spill. A painter mutters a prayer for steady hands. A scribe hums a motet under his breath. A binder at the back clamps boards that look like doorways for mice. Light joke 2. If you labelled this workshop with modern job titles, you'd have a full startup content, design, QA, ops, logistics plus a cat, which is your compliance department. Trade routes thrum under everything. You feel Venice in the lapis, Genoa in the vermilion, North Africa in the gum, English sheep in the parchment, Hanseatic ships in the brass clasps that will later click like sensible applause, mainstream anchor to lay along the map. Italian ports funneled Eastern pigments into Europe. Flemish towns brokered finished books northward. Fairs like Champagne's braided contracts and couriers, so that a student in Paris might read a Lombard commentary bound on oak from the Baltic, written in Bologna's law hand by a scribe who still dreams in Latin and stew. Historians still argue whether guild regulations protected quality or sharpened monopolies. Your ledger says both can happen when rules meet rent. A patron brings his taste in with his purse. One wants margins prim as a sermon, another wants hunters, stags, and a favourite lapdog chasing initials down the page. You accommodate, because books are mirrors for the eyes that paid for them. You jot a note to yourself not to put a snail joust in the bishop's copy, unless the bishop has a sense of humour, a coin toss you're not willing to flip. You remember your Section 11 diplomacy about spiritus versus spiritus, and apply the same caution to heraldry. Get the tinctures right, or endure a lecture that lasts longer than Lent. Contracts hum with clauses. Delivery by Michaelmas, 5% more if Easter arrives early and colours cost extra. Penalties if the gold looks like brass. The stationer scratches a witness's name beneath yours, then sand sprinkles the ink to dry it fast. Quirky tidbit. Some contracts even stipulate the presence of line fillers and pen-flourished initials, those twirling red-blue tangles that dance into blankness, proof that clients learn to speak the house dialect of decoration, the way regulars know a bakery's names for pastries. You add a flourish to the receipt for practice, and because you can, you shoulder a wrapped quire and step back into the street. A cart rattles by carrying books chained for a library. The chain clinks like practical music. A shop hawk's horn windows the poor man's glass that will someday keep ash off your gold. A furrier argues with a tanner about the price of offcuts the binder wants for N-band cores. Light joke 3. The city is one enormous supply list wearing shoes. You catch a glimpse of a pilgrim kissing a reliquary and wonder whether anyone ever kissed a book. Then you realize they do, all the time, on title pages and oaths, with lips and laws. At dusk you deliver a finished quire to a student who looks like a candle that forgot to eat. He flips the pages and his face softens. The rubric told him where to breathe. The gloss told him where to argue. The margin stayed quiet, where his exam panic will later scribble prayers. Mainstream fact to nod with. The rise of the universities created a sustained demand for standardized texts. Gratian's Decretum, Lombard's sentences, Aristotle via translation, so workshops specialized, and the city learned to think in quires. Historians still argue whether this market democratized learning or just redistributed constraint. But the smell of ink on the students' hands says hunger met supply, and both left marks. A messenger arrives, breathless with an order from a duke, who wants a psalter of ostentation, purple-stained vellum, silver text, gold initials, fat as pastry, borders so crowded even the rabbit from Section 9 would call HR. You price it without flinching, because you know the cost in hours and minerals and human eyes. You also know the afterlife. This book will sit in a coffer, then a chapel, then a sale, then a library, then a digitization lab, where someone will zoom in on your manicule's cuff and compliment your stitching. You don't say that part out loud. You just ask whether the Duke prefers diapered backgrounds à la Paris or small landscapes à la Flemish realism, because politics loves a picture that looks like home. Night folds the street into itself. You lock the stationer's door and smell the day on your sleeves. Gum, leather, smoke, a little gold if you're lucky. The fan in someone's room many centuries off keeps its steady tone while you count the ways books travel. Packed in barrels, wrapped in cloth, chained to desks, carried in satchels, prayed over, pawned, stolen, gifted, kissed. You remember the oak boards and clasps from Section 12 and feel relieved again. Hardware is just empathy for parchment. Before sleep, you tally. 1 contract signed, 2 pesha returned, 3 shells of azurite refreshed, 4 patrons satisfied, 1 student less hungry, 1 cat still indifferent. You add a note in the ledger margin, don't forget saffron, and underline it with a flourish because even errands deserve a little theatre. Historians still argue whether the city diluted the contemplative virtues of the cloister or translated them into civic forms. You think the prayer simply changed shoes. The bell learned to ring in coin. The page learned to listen to commerce. The book learned to survive both. You close your eyes and see the map light up. Badakhshan blue riding mule trains. North African gum in bales. English vellum stacked like winter. Italian knives glinting. Flemish brass ticking like stars. All of it ends in a rectangle under a lamp, where a hand, maybe yours, maybe someone else's, dips a quill and writes a line that darkens as it dries. The street goes quiet. The workshop sleeps with its nose full of paste and pride. And far away, a patron opens a clasp and inhales the first page like bread. You take the finished volume in both hands, the way you'd lift a sleeping cat firm, respectful, prepared for opinions, and you learn how reading wears a book into biography. The clasps from Section 12 click like tiny door latches, and your thumbs find the same places other thumbs have loved. Lower outer corners, where skin oils polish pigskin to a shine you can almost see your candle in. You open, and the first leaf exhales that cool scent of vellum and wheat paste, and right away the page begins telling on its owners. A thumb smudge blooms beside a favourite prayer. A drop of candle wax glints like a bead. The faint shadow of a pressed flower presses back with the memory of a day someone wanted to keep. Mainstream fact to keep in your palm. By the later Middle Ages, the Book of Hours became the most common private devotional book in Western Europe, customized with family saints and local calendars, and the wear patterns in these volumes rubbed miniatures. Thumbed prayers map devotion like footprints. You read with fingers as much as with eyes. The rubric you laid with vermilion in Section 6 still blushes at obsecrote and O intemerata, those go-to Marian prayers whose pages now gleam with a soft polish where lips and fingertips have visited. Quirky tidbit to smile at without scolding. Repeated kissing of images, especially the Virgin and Child, left dark osculation marks that conservators can spot in raking light. Some owners even pin tiny veils over a beloved face to protect the paint, which is devotion plus preventive conservation. Before that was a job title. Your manicule, cuff immaculate as ever, points at a margin where a reader wrote, "Hic orare fortiter, pray hard here," and the paper-thin pen flourish seems to nod. You run a finger along four-edged tabs made from slivers of parchment registers sticking out like shy tongues, so you can hop to matins or to the office of the dead. A strip of woven silk marks yesterday's place. Another, knotted with 3 little beads, doubles as a rosary in miniature when hands are tired and math is difficult. The book wears its habits like clothing. A chemise binding in one patron's copy drapes a long linen skirt over boards, so it can be carried tied to a belt without scraping, while another volume sports corner bosses that have learned every tabletop in a chapel's lifetime. Light joke 1. For a species that can't stop losing socks, humans are surprisingly good at accessorizing books. At a desk, you read aloud so quietly that the candle thinks you're telling it a secret, because reading for most people still tastes like sound. Historians still argue whether the spread of silent, subvocal reading changed inner life, deepening private meditation, or whether it mostly tagged along with crowded classrooms and the rise of pace-speed study. Tonight your lips move a little, your breath evens, and the page answers by slowing your blood in the nicest way. The fan you told everyone to turn on hums in your imagination like a great hall's draft, and the quill's soft scratch from sections 4 and 5 is now your inner metronome for sentences. You thumb the calendar and feel the difference between ink and gold with your skin. The punched ground from section 7 throws pinpricks of light that shift as your hand does. Someone, maybe a duchess, maybe a clerk with excellent taste, has rubbed street. Catherine's wheel until the blue field around it darkened like evening. A few pages later, a saint no one remembers stands crisp, untouched, flawless. Neglect, the kind that keeps paint pristine. You grin at the honesty of it. The book whispers who mattered where, and no marginal sermon is needed. You meet owners not by names, but by tics. One writes manicules at every miracle, fingers wagging like cheerful ushers. Another writes nota bene in a stern hand that scolds even when praising. Here, a child, later, has copied the alphabet into a blank leaf, the gaze styled like the serpent of insular days you practiced in section 5. There a widow has penciled in birth and death dates in the calendar, making that tidy grid into a little family archive. A tiny round stain near the lower gutter smells faintly of nutmeg, if you choose nostalgia, spiced wine perhaps, though the sober answer is, it's just a stain, and you're sentimental. Light joke 2. If your book could talk, it would say, I contain multitudes, and also soup. Devotion travels with hardware. In a parish, the chained library at the East End keeps sermon books available. You turn a folio on a lectern where a chain clinks like polite thunder. Back at home, a lectern the size of a small dog holds your volume at a safe angle so gravity doesn't bully the sewing. You set a brass pricket farther from the foredge than your anxious side insists, because wax is forever, and you've made peace with small drips, but not with lakes. The page is a field where your habits garden. The raised bands you massaged in section 12 support your wrist as you trace a line. The end bands keep the head from splaying when you get enthusiastic. Some owners accessorize devotion like they accessorize wardrobes. Pilgrim badges, small lead-tin tokens from shrines, are stitched onto end leaves like medals. A scrap of embroidered cloth stands in for a relic, making the book a reliquary that turns every prayer into a pilgrimage you do sitting down. You feel the thread ends with your fingertip, and imagine the maker's breath in the knot. Quirky tidbit. A few surviving volumes still have pressed plants pinned into margins, yarrow, rosemary herb gardens that forgot to be temporary and became time capsules. You slide a hand beneath a leaf and feel a ridge where a parchment scar lies under paint. Remember those men's and butterflies from section 11, then realize the illuminator solved it with a painted bridge. A rabbit trots across. You laugh quietly, the candle hates drama, and feel the relief that small faults turned into narrative. Reading is full of that, errors confessed, then recruited for better stories. Mainstream anchor to hum, while your finger follows lines. Glossed Bibles and scholastic texts were laid out for conversation, center columns of scripture flanked by commentary bands, and the page taught the hand to shuffle between voices. Your fingertips now learn that choreography instantly, like they remember a dance step you've always known. Not every reader is gentle. You open a page and see knife-hatched checks over a paragraph someone's medieval highlighter, a study habit carved, not drawn. In another, A furious vacat announces that a section should be skipped. A later hand disagrees in the margin with a polite, "No, it shouldn't." Books are social even when only one person is in the room. You decide not to referee. Light joke 3. The correct way to win a marginal argument is to be born 2 centuries later with cleaner ink. The light itself becomes a partner. Winter morning rakes low and lets your pricking holes glitter like small stars. Summer noon washes the page so bright that gold looks like cool water hiding a sun. You learn to tilt. The habit becomes muscle memory. You angle the leaf to read without shadow, to spare the paint, to help the punched diaper behind a saint's robe catch exactly enough light to look embroidered. All that burnishing you did feels like a promise kept. You notice where the page is thinning at the lower corner and train yourself to turn by lifting from the middle edge with a finger pad, not by pinching the tip like a hawk with a mouse. The book relaxes every time you remember. You keep a bit of clean vellum nearby as an interleaving when your hands feel less than saintly. You slide it under while you read so oil kisses it instead of the miniature. Historians still argue whether readers were generally this careful or whether you're simply the sort who alphabetizes your spices. The survival of so many luxe books hints that many hands were kind enough. You close the volume for a while and read its outside. Scratches on bosses talk about desks with gritty hospitality. A darker patch at the foredge says a palm rested here while a child learned the pater noster. The spine's raised bands show a little bright at the top, where habit lifts it from the shelf by the head cap. Don't do that. You remind yourself, scoop from both boards. On the back paster down, a tidy note in a later hand declares ex libris and a name, and below that, a price in a currency long retired. Books survive owners the way rivers survive bridges. At night, you set the book flat with a gentle weight, clasps closed, fan humming, gold quiet. You think about all the ways light and skin change a page kissing saints, counting prayers with tabs, underlining with knives, arguing in ink, and none of it feels like damage when it's done with love and a little sense. Your rabbit from section 9 peeks from a margin to make sure you remembered the shell gold touch on leaf tips. Your snail reminds you that readers move slowly and win anyway. You pat the boards and the book answers with a small, satisfied click. It will wake with you tomorrow, ready to polish new fingerprints into old devotion. And 100 years from now, some scholar with a microscope will see both of you in the sheen. You follow the book the way you'd follow a friend through a crowd, one hand on its shoulder, steady, ready to steer when history elbows. The first jolt comes with a bell that isn't yours. A king dissolves monasteries, carts rumble, libraries bleed into auctions and attics, and your carefully ruled ladders learn to climb onto new shelves. Mainstream fact to hold while your breath shortens. During the English dissolution of the monasteries, 1536, 1541, vast numbers of manuscripts were dispersed, destroyed, or repurposed. Those that survived did so by luck, theft, purchase, or sudden usefulness as binding waste. You picture your book ducking into a trunk, a clerk whispering, "Just until the weather clears," and you pat the boards like you can help. Not all dangers shout. A coal pops from a brazier, wax kisses a miniature, a roof forgets its job during a storm. You imagine a scribe centuries later unpasting a board and finding your margins reborn as paster downs inside someone else's ledger. Your rabbit pressed into service as a private joke on the spine. Quirky tidbit to tuck under a clasp. Binders often recycled old leaves for spine linings, guards, and covers. Today, conservators peel those book sandwiches apart like archaeologists, and sometimes rescue entire sermons hiding beneath paste. A library made of leftovers. You like the thrift, even if your pride sulks for a minute. Fire clears its throat. You feel heat from rooms you never entered. Scriptoriums that woke as chimneys. Houses that forgot to care about sparks. A particular blaze prowls your thoughts. A library where flames licked names and catalogues overnight. Where morning discovered charcoal that used to be saints. You do what readers always do when faced with ash. You look for edges that didn't crumble. A corner of gilded initial still mirrors light. A punched rosette winks through soot. The manicule's cuff survives in ghost outline like a sign saying, "I was here," still pointing. Light joke 1. Your pointing hand remains the world's most optimistic emoji, even when it's basically dust. Water pretends to be the hero and sometimes is. A quick bucket brigade saves boards and bands. A swollen choir dries under weighted blotters that smell like wet grain. Other times, water becomes slow trouble, cellars that don't know when to stop being rivers, floods that teach vellum new curves. You ride a memory the book earned without you the day someone ironed leaves under interleaving and whispered, "Please," at every sizzle. The day someone else froze a dripping stack to suspend mould long enough to plan a rescue because, yes, freezers moonlight as monasteries where mischief sleeps. Historians still argue whether emergency washing of soot-blackened pages in certain disasters did more good than harm, or whether patient, dry cleaning would have saved more pigment. The debate is a quilt of good intentions stitched to irretrievable moments. You choose compassion for both the hands and the leaves. War arrives wearing boots. Books evacuate in crates to basements, castles, salt mines, and farmhouses where pigs snore gently next to Aristotle. A crate stencils your title like a passport. A manifest misspells the author you copied by candle. Somewhere, a child sits on your bundle to reach the window and see if the convoy is here. Mainstream anchor to set quietly on the edge. In the 20th century, librarians and curators across Europe dispersed, hid, and later repatriated collections during both world wars. Cataloguing afterwards sometimes read like detective work with missing persons and false names. Your clasps, clever from section 12, click through those years like small survivalists. Time gives you other kinds of rescue, less dramatic, more dazzling. A scholar turns a page under bluish lamps, and writing you never saw emerges from under your own text. Iron-gall whispers that oxidized invisibly until multispectral imaging coaxed them back. Palimpsest becomes conversation. Earlier prayers and proofs rising into view like footprints under low tide. Light joke 2. Your book discovers karaoke, the old lyrics were always there. Now the right light makes them sing. You think of glare and gold and pounce and how they never expected to meet cameras, and you forgive yourself for feeling proud on their behalf. Laboratories smell different from scriptoria, less stew, more solvent, but the promises feel similar. Glass slides, cradle pigment crumbs you left behind like dandruff. Ramen lasers ask lapis to introduce itself. Fiber optics inspect a stitch you tied when you were trying not to sneeze. Mainstream fact to rest your chin on. Non-invasive techniques, Raman spectroscopy, XRF, multispectral imaging. Now let conservators identify pigments, inks, and underdrawings without picking a fight with the page. Historians still argue whether certain colour shifts we see darkened greens, browned reds come more from recipe faults, light exposure, or later restorations that aged badly. The lab's patient instruments answer with percentages instead of certainties, and you accept that humility remains the proper binder. The quiet enemies keep working. Insects cheat. Bookworms, really beetle larvae, nibble galleries that look, rudely, like marginal ornaments you didn't authorize. A librarian taps a closed volume and listens for the sound of powder, soft as secrets, then glares at the plank floor like a sheriff. Freezers return, this time not for floods but for pests. Your book takes a nap at minus numbers, wakes relieved, acts normal. A little leather lifts, a little paste dries. Someone with hands like good news relays, hinges and retucks headcaps. Quirky tidbit. A few libraries once kept curses in their flyleaves. Who steals this book? May he be boiled in oil. An early security tag with better poetry. Your volume's ex libris settles for an ownership note and a dignified frown. The afterlives multiply. Monks read, students cram, dukes brag, reformers scowl, collectors swoon, auctioneers purr. Curators arrange light, so your gold from section 7 glows but doesn't blister. A digitization lab straps you like a patient astronaut and, click by click, lets your rabbit from section 9 and your ivy from section 8 learn the internet. Light joke 3. Your margin beasts develop followers and start giving tediously sincere interviews about process. Somewhere, a graduate student zooms to 400% on your manicule's cuff and writes 20 pages about power and pointing. You decide not to haunt them. Too much paperwork. Reading rooms become your new cloisters. Silence hums like a fan. Foam cradles replace elbows. Snakes of soft weights replace rings and thumbs. A pencil, never a pen, records what you already knew. You feel large in these rooms, like a country under glass. When a reader turns your leaf, the good way pads on the middle edge, not pinches at the corner. You bless them with whatever authority a book can muster. When they forget, a gentle librarian materializes and rescues everyone's dignity at once. You remember your own practice from section 14 and realize manners are just the art of not making repair work for strangers. Your survival is not just luck, it's collagen that stayed springy, it's boards that refuse to warp, its clasps that acted like little weather spells, its gold that did not tarnish because it was pure stubbornness, beaten thin. It's 1,000 small decisions from Section 2 through Section 12 that turned labour into longevity. Mainstream anchor to hum. Parchment, properly prepared and housed, outlasts most paper. That's why 9th century Carolingian pages still look like polite snow, while some 19th century wood pulp sheets crumble like pastry. Historians still argue whether the worst damage to manuscripts was done by Reformation bonfires, Enlightenment rebinding, Victorian cleaning, or modern neglect. The honest answer is yes, and also by time, which is undefeated but often lazy. You travel again, from a chained desk to a glass case, from a parish trunk to a campus vault, from a duchess's coffer to a phone in a city you can't spell. A child touches the vitrine with the flat of a hand and fogs the glass. Behind the fog your gold winks, behind the wink your rabbit rehearses, behind the rabbit your ruled ladder holds its breath. You realize the book's job never changed. Hold the line, catch the light, give the mind a place to rest. Night leans in, a guard checks the locks, a censor considers humidity and clears its throat at the HVAC. In the hush, you can hear everything you've already done: lime baths and lunella scrapes, pricking constellations and stylus valleys, quills cut and recut, ink that darkened as it breathed, pigments ground like small songs, gold persuaded with breath, borders tied into manners, jokes smuggled under psalms, bells pacing your day, knives and breadcrumbs for giving, cords and boards and clasps making a spine that keeps its promises. You look at the page, and the page looks back like an elder who has seen your tantrums and your homework and likes you anyway. You lift 2 fingers, the good turn, from the middle edge, and the leaf moves with the sound of distant snow. The fan you ask people to switch on keeps humming somewhere, centuries across, and the hum reaches you here, inside the afterlife where manuscripts learn to breathe in museums and labs and rooms with careful lamps. Your book is alive, boringly, beautifully alive. You let the room soften, as if the walls themselves are exhaling, and your breath decides to match them, longer now, rounder at the ends, like a ribbon that remembers how to curl. The lights fall to a kind glow, the kind that forgives, and every edge turns polite leather less sharp, gold less bright, even the little manicule lowering its finger as if to say, not now, not anymore, we did enough for one evening. You picture the page closing very slowly, not from impatience but from a practiced kindness, boards drifting together until the clasps find each other by memory and click with that quiet certainty you've come to trust. The book grows heavier in your hands, the way a sleeping cat does, not actually heavier, only more here, and you set it down, flat and safe, and your palms remember the cool of oak and the softness of the turned leather, and your shoulders release the last little knot you forgot you were saving for later. Somewhere the fan keeps its steady whisper, and you let it borrow your thoughts, smoothing them, stretching them, making them long as lines ruled with a stylus in a margin that will never hurry you. Colour fades to dusk, lapis to evening, vermilion to ember, verdigris to a patient meadow, and the gold, proud all day, accepts the dim and becomes a moon more than a sun. Even the rabbit, alert in the corner of a thought, sets down the tiny trumpet and folds its ears, and the snail, tireless champion of slow victories, tucks into its spiral house and considers dreams. If there's anything left to fix, you leave it for tomorrow. The breadcrumb and the penknife can wait. You have done enough careful looking for one night, enough listening for the soft scrape of quill on vellum, enough learning the grammar of quiet. Let the book hold your place. Let the margin keep your joke. Let the gold remember the warmth of your breath and return it to you as a small, kind light that you can carry into sleep.